Oh, I'm sorry, Ashley, are we online? We're online now, thank you. Welcome everybody to the Tuesday, March 2nd special meeting of the Town Commissioners. Let's do the opening ceremonies. If we stand and do the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag
of the
United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you all very much. I'd like to take one moment of silence for all of our military around the world and for all those people in the United States and the world that's dealing with the COVID-19 virus. Thank you all very much. Let's do a roll call of people. I'll call your name and you say whether you're here or not. Commissioner Jasinski.
Present.
Commissioner Bauer. Commissioner Persinger. Mr. Bauer, turn your mic on, please.
I'm here.
Thank you very much, sir. Commissioner Persinger.
I'm here.
And with us also is Town Manager Bill Zilber.
Here.
And our Town Attorney, Mr. Fred Townsend. And Ashley Sander, our Town Clerk. Welcome all. As we adopt the agenda here, I'd like to have possibly, if you all would think about first, I've never quite understood why we did two disparate or two totally separate public hearings and then went back and started discussing and voting on something, for instance, that was in the first public hearing, and then go back and discuss and vote in the second public hearing. I would like, if possible, to have the individual public hearing and then go to the discuss and vote item. It seems more logical to me. Would that be all right with everybody? If so, we take.
I'll motion that.
Yeah.
Okay, so is there a second?
There's a second. I just want to make sure Fred says it's okay for us to change the order in a public hearing situation.
Yeah. I had considered that, and I think that it's fine given the rather minor change we're making to the agenda. Okay. I don't think the public is going to be is going to lose their opportunity to participate on either of the matters.
So before I ask you your opinion, your vote on that, we would do public hearing on an ordinance to amend Chapter 185 Utilities Code of Town of Dewey Beach, and then go down to action item 1, discuss and possibly vote to approve an ordinance to amend Chapter 185 Utilities Code Town of Dewey Beach. Then we would come back to the second public hearing on an ordinance to amend Chapter 167 Code of Town of Dewey Beach about the lodging tax. And we would then, after that public hearing, go to item number 3, discuss and possibly vote to approve an orders to amend 167 of the Code of Dewey Beach regarding taxes. And then the final, to finish up, we would do number 2, which is discuss and possibly vote to approve a supplement to the Town of Dewey Beach Street Maintenance Agreement with DelDOT. So that's what we would be voting on. That's what was motioned. All in favor, say aye.
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 Aye. Any negatives, any nays, any abstentions? Then it's unanimous. It's 4-0, Ashley, because we don't have Mr. Stevenson yet. So, can I have a motion to adopt the agenda as changed? Commissioner
Motion.
Bauer? So
Motion.
moved. Seconded by
David.
Mr. Jasinski. Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
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 Any against, any abstentions? Hearing none, it's unanimous. Announcements and updates. I'd like to tell everybody that on March 4th at 3:30 p.m. there's a marketing meeting to discuss their fundraising efforts. On March 5th at 5:30 p.m. there's a budget and finance meeting to discuss the 2021-22 budget, the upcoming new budget. And on March 8th at 5 p.m., there's a joint Commissioner, Budget and Finance, Audit, and Investment Committees, plural, meeting to discuss the general fund policy. And then on March 12th at 12 noon, there's a regular town committee meeting, commissioners meeting. So anybody else have any announcements they'd like to bring up other than Ashley's birthday? No? Okay. I'm going to ask Mr. Townsend to take care of the first public hearing on an ordinance to amend Chapter 185 Utilities Code of the Town of Dewey Beach, Delaware, by adding thereto a section relating to the regulation of wireless facilities. Mr. Townsend.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So at this time, we'll convene the public hearing and we'll hear from the public who have comments on both the ordinance, which is an authorizing ordinance, and the wireless facilities design standards, which is an important component of that. So I want the commissioners to keep in mind that while it's fair to describe it as a single item, as an ordinance, that ordinance does refer to design standards, and that's where much of the criteria for regulation exists. Ashley, who do we have who'd like to be heard from, and is Mr. Divis among them?
He is. Would you like me to bring him in first?
Yes.
Okay.
Good morning, Mr. Divis. Mr. Divis, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Are you able to hear me?
I am. Yeah,
Okay.
I am. So I'd like to ask you just to repeat your name for the record and give us an address. Now, we are going to limit time today. We've got a big agenda, but this is an important item. And I would encourage the commissioners to consider extending time to perhaps to industry who may need additional time to comment on the ordinance, but we'll see how it goes. Mr. Divis?
Yeah, my name is Joe Divis. I am with AT&T, 950 Madison Avenue, Norristown, Pennsylvania is the address.
Mm-hmm.
For the record, I want to just make a comment that the ordinance that is being considered today and the design manual were not posted on the website until midday yesterday or yesterday afternoon. So we're kind of, I'm actually reviewing it as we speak. I don't know how that, butts up against notice requirements, but I put that on the record. I will say that we did provide comments, I guess, back in December, participated in one of the public hearings and unfortunately didn't see a lot of changes from our suggestions at that time. There still seems to be some arbitrary definitions of antennas and cabinets that don't reflect the technology or the equipment manufacturers who make the equipment. We don't make the equipment as providers. We have to get that from the original equipment manufacturers, and different equipment, whether they're antennas in particular, serve different purposes. So I think Verizon and Bonnie Metz submitted some comments this morning that reflected that. There seems to be some contradiction in the design manual where in one place it prohibits wireless equipment from being closer than 100 feet from each other. In another place, it says 300 feet from each other. Not sure why that is. Certainly 300 feet is, we think, excessive. They're both arbitrary numbers. Don't necessarily reflect what might be the needs to provide service to customers. So I think there may be some other things, but like I said, we've only had less than 24 hours to review what the current ordinance and design manual are as they've been posted on the website. So,
Mr. Divis, do you have the design standards? You say you're referring to them now, or you're reviewing them now, is that right?
Yeah.
You just made specific reference to a subsection B of the section titled Placement and Siting of Small Wireless Facilities, where it
correct.
contains a reference to 300 feet.
Yeah.
And then a little further back, there is a reference to
100 feet. under
100
citing
feet.
Prohibitions.
For new structures, right?
Correct. Well, that's unclear whether it's for new structures. It just says citing prohibition. So it actually is kind of counterintuitive if you are co-locating, which is, I think, what the town would want.
Mm-hmm.
The distance between facilities, particularly different company facilities, wouldn't seem to be as great as if you're talking new structure. So it just, in our view, it just doesn't seem to make sense, and certainly on a reading this morning, basically, or yesterday, seems to contradict itself.
Okay, so where do you stand on the 100-foot requirement?
I think that
as it would be applied
that's much better than 300 feet. It is certainly, it remains arbitrary, but if you're asking me between 100 or 300 feet, I would certainly prefer 300. Because and I think we talked about this before, radio signals and radio service doesn't necessarily fit into arbitrary planning protocols, as it may be. It is radio, and radio has propagation tendencies, and we can't change those tendencies. And on top of that, you also have customer and consumer traffic that is exploding. And so anytime you're looking at creating an ordinance like this, it should reflect, if it's good planning and good policy, should reflect the realities of how wireless service is provided, and the limitations of how we can engineer the network and the service.
Okay, so Mr. Divis, the issue of the inconsistency could be remedied, in your opinion, by changing that subsection B to 100 feet. Is that right?
I would think. It would appear to be that way. I don't know. What do you think as counsel?
Well, this is our opportunity to ask questions.
Okay. All right.
Do you wish to direct any more remarks to either the design standards or to the ordinance? Because there are very few changes in the ordinance since it was originally posted, and many of those changes were in response to comments that were made during the Planning Commission.
There were several. I did see the substantial change definition was included, but I have not had a chance to review that based upon our suggestion, and being in conformity with the FCC definition. That's part of my testimony, is that we haven't really had as much time, I think, as we would have liked, because it was not posted until midday or late yesterday.
Isn't this the second time this ordinance has been posted by the commissioners following the Planning Commission meeting? Or is this it's the second time, isn't that right? Mm-hmm. That's what I thought. Do you have anything else for us, Mr. Divis?
No, sir. I think we'd go back to what we submitted prior. I do note that there were some changes, but I still think with the design manual that there could be some other adoptions. including, where feasible, and a waiver provision, in the sense of if you're going to keep certain definitions in, there should be some process where they can be waived, if there's, demonstration of need and propriety.
Okay. Do the commissioners have any questions for Mr. Divis?
Going to interrupt and just say that Mr. Stevens has joined us. Thank you, Mr. Stevens. We appreciate it. Your mic is, there you go. Thank you, sir.
Sorry for my delay. I had trouble getting in.
Mr. Persinger, questions for Mr. Divis?
Yeah, it's kind of directed at Mr. Divis as well as you, the town attorney. I think I'm a little confused about the issue of co-location. And that's something that, we seem to have been in favor of and have recommended, but I'm not sure that there's a clear understanding of what co-location means. I mean, I think when we talk generally about co-location, most people would think about locating two different pieces of equipment on the same pole. But that seems to be not what we're talking about here, particularly if we're saying that in essence, that small cell wireless equipment must be at least 100 feet or 300 feet from another small cell antenna or wireless equipment. So you obviously aren't going to have two pieces of equipment on the same pole that are 100 feet apart. So I'm a little confused, and I'd like to hear from Mr. Divis on what we're really talking about here with respect to co-location. And from
Mr. Townsend, would it be all right if I address that?
Certainly.
Yeah, this is Mr. Cook. The intent was on separate poles that two different pieces of equipment, therefore on two separate poles would be at least 100 feet apart. The reason that was brought up was because every single time that Mr. Dedes and myself and the town, Don Hanks, the town building official, went out with the people who were going to put the poles in, the companies that were going to put the poles in, they said it was impossible to co-locate. In no uncertain terms, there was no way they were going to be able to co-locate on our 35-foot tall poles. But go ahead, Mr. Townsend. I apologize for interrupting.
We certainly could easily add a provision that makes it clear that any distance requirements other than height from the ground would not apply in the case of co-location. So that's clearly what was intended, although I can certainly see the argument that this language seems to prohibit co-location because it's requiring a minimum distance between wireless equipment installations. Mr. Divis, do you have any additional comment on that?
I would simply say that co-location can mean a couple different things depending on the context. One is multiple carriers on a single structure, which small cells basically is not because of technical reasons. But it also is just using existing structures to place wireless equipment on, whether it's utility poles, street lights, things of that nature. I think if I heard, if you could repeat, Mr. Townsend, how you just characterized that. Because I'm not sure what, I want to make sure I understood what you said.
Oh, I was saying that the design standards could be amended with a clarification that the minimum distance requirements for equipment shall not apply in the case of co-location. There is
okay. Yeah, that I think that would make sense. If you're using stuff that's there already.
Mr. Persinger, does that address your question well enough?
It addresses the question. I'm just not sure that the design standards say that on page 2, because what's there now is this minimum of 300 feet, and it's in the context of co-location on an existing pole or building.
Well, maybe we don't need that provision B at all if it's in the context of co-location. So maybe the way to address it is to strike it.
Mhm. It could be.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Any other questions or comments
No,
from the
no,
commissioners?
not for me.
Mr. Dedes, your mic is off. If you've got a question for Mr. Divis, is that right?
No, I just wanted to clarify. I think the discussion on the minimum of 300 feet really addressed having one sole provider, such as AT&T or whoever, that they couldn't create another pole within 300 feet of the existing pole that they already have one on. I think that was the intent. It had nothing to do with co-location.
So that that prohibition should appear under the new structure criteria that follows this. So again, I think that's an additional argument for deleting subsection B from the placement and siting of small wireless facilities.
Okay.
Mr. Zolper.
Yes, good morning, Mr. Divis, thank you, and I apologize to the mayor and to the attorney and the commissioners, but I just want to ask you a question. I'm new, and I've missed some of the previous discussion on this, but I'm sure there's some other people that would like to know this. If the beach is mainly occupied 3 months out of the year between the hours of 10 and 5, and everybody else after 5 in the afternoon is up along Route 1, and in the off season, there's nobody on the beach, why are we putting the poles out near the beach and not on Route 1? Just a short answer on that would be fine. Thank you.
I can't answer that only because I don't know. We don't have any. Let me step back a little bit. I think it's something of a hypothetical question. Because for my company anyway, I'm not sure we have any plans on the books, or at least with the town currently, on what our network needs are going to be. You still, irrespective of my company specifically, you still need to provide service where people are, and the way networks are configured and the way they operate and the way we have to provide at peak times. We have to build our network for peak time operability. So if there are going to be times, even if it's only 3-4 months out of the year, where the beaches are going to be packed with people I would almost guarantee that everybody has a device, whether they're using it consistently or not. Some people go down there, they read, or they do other things, but we have to plan and deliver service for those folks. So I think it's not an either or, it's both with respect to where our infrastructure has to go to deliver service for our customers and your constituents and your visitors.
Hey, thank you for answering that. I know all those people come off the beach after 5 o'clock and they're in town, but it just seems like the poles could be there, and I understand there's an issue with range. So thank you for answering the question.
Thank you for your question, sir.
Do the commissioners or staff have any additional questions for Mr. Divis at this time? So it looks like they don't. Mr. Divis, I'm sure you're going to stay with us. Is that during the
I will.
course of this conversation? Thank you. So
Thank you, sir.
we may reach out to you again.
Okay.
Ms. Sander. Mr. Cook?
No, thank you. You go ahead. There's other people in the waiting room.
The next person we have is Marty Seitz. And Fred, would you like me to leave Mr. Divis on here or put him in the waiting room for the time being?
I think put him in a waiting room, please. Mhm. Mr. Seitz, are you with us?
The next person we have is
Mr. Seitz, can you hear me? Is he on the YouTube?
Yeah, this is Marty Seitz. I don't know if you can hear me.
We can.
Okay.
Just give us
Yes.
give us an address, please, and then we'd like to hear your comments.
Yeah, it's 2 Swede Street, that's Swedes Street in Dewey Beach. Now I want to make sure
We're hearing you just fine, but you may want to turn down the volume on that YouTube channel so it doesn't.
okay, let me try to, yes.
We can hear you fine. I don't know if you're hearing us on delay.
Yeah, I'm gonna get off of you.
Right.
Okay, now I should be on Zoom alone.
We can hear you fine. You can go ahead and begin.
Okay, yeah, thank you. No, I wanted to make, well, 2 comments. One is I think with the action of the state legislatures, namely Pete Schwarzkopf and others, sort of mandating that the town has to accept this. Certainly the focus on the standards is an important, is what we can do as a town, and it's an important part of it. I think there's some things that are missing on our understanding. For example, when people say that it's impossible to co-locate, I think that's wrong. I think you can co-locate if you spend more money for equipment. In other words, if you get the minimum quality equipment, you have to have independent poles. But if you get higher quality equipment, so there's a parameter that's missing here. That is that people are showing us the cheapest insulation they can have. The other comment I wanted to make was that I think that the focus of the telecom companies on the beach is really misplaced. This is in my mind, a small market. In the summer, we have 400 people on the beach for at most 10 weeks, really from 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock in the morning to 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And the only way that they can these 5G networks can be used is if streaming is an extensive product on the beach. In other words, if people are bringing on big screen TVs in cabanas and showing baseball games or football games to their small community of people, 5 or 10 people, you might use the 5G. But my prediction would be that the town would prohibit that. In other words, the town has prohibited alcohol on the beach. They prohibited smoking on the beach. And I'm sure we would prohibit group gatherings for large screen visualization of sporting events or certain movie features, feature movies and so forth. And I would say that the town should do what they're doing as best they can in the standards, which is a big part of this meeting. But we'd also should notify the telecom companies that in fact the town is very likely to prohibit streaming on a large scale on the beach, just like we prohibited alcohol and we prohibit tobacco use. That's my overall comment. You can look at the market. The market really isn't there like you see at airports or transportation hubs where a lot of people are coming through with a lot of wireless equipment. That just doesn't happen at the beach. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Seitz. Mr. Jasinski, you have a question for Mr. Seitz?
Yeah, I did have a question for Planning Commissioner Seitz. I realize I might be kind of putting you on the spot, but do you happen to recall any of the sources for your information on the fact that co-location is possible if people or if a provider purchases the correct equipment?
Well, it's just my experience is that when you people co-locate electronic equipment, they have to go to the higher grade equipment.
Okay.
I could research that certainly and come up with something that I would think would be appropriate.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Anyone else? Thank you, Mr. Seitz.
Okay, thank you.
Next, we have Gary Kay.
while he's connecting, is it evident that we have anyone else in the waiting room who is industry related?
Not that I can see clearly by the name that's listed.
Mhm. Okay.
Hey, we did receive an email from a Chris Souza, I believe it is. And it's asking why these transmitters cannot go up on the water tower.
There's a Cindy Souza in the waiting room.
Cindy, sorry.
I can bring her in next if you'd like, or I can bring her in now while we're waiting for Gary Kay to connect.
Just want to recognize her question.
Well, what do you say we do that? We invite her to join us while Gary Kay is connecting.
Go up on the water tower.
There's a Cindy Souza in the waiting room.
Cindy, sorry.
Oh,
I can bring her in next if you'd like, or I can bring her in now while we're waiting for Gary Kay to connect.
fuck.
Just want to recognize her question.
My question is fine.
So Cindy, we can hear you on the. What do you say we do that? On the broadcast while Gary Kay is connected. If you could turn down your YouTube speaker and just participate through the Zoom, we'd appreciate it.
Hi there. I'm just curious as to why so many towers need to be put every couple of blocks. Is there not another way to do this?
Miss, is it Souza? I can't read your
Souza.
last name.
Yes, it's Souza.
Souza. Okay. Could you
Cindy.
give us an address for the record, please?
Cindy Souza, 113 West Street in Dewey.
So it sounds like you have a concern and kind of a question. Could you want to repeat that for us?
Sure. My question is, why is it that so many towers need to be put up and down the beach? Why can't 5 towers work for our entire town? We're not that big. Geography wise.
Right. Well, I think we've heard from some industry representatives, both in writing and including Mr. Divis personally, who's indicated that it's a coverage issue and that we've got multiple providers all required to, or all desiring to provide coverage to the beachgoers on a peak basis. And that appears to be the main issue. It's also related to the technology itself. We've heard that 5G is a technology that requires more of a direct line from devices to the poles than maybe prior technology. But I'm not the right person to be answering that question, and I don't think anyone actually here claims to be an expert on that. So thank you. Any questions for Ms. Souza or comments?
Yeah, just real quick comment. Cindy, what we've heard is that the coverage for 5G is 2 blocks roughly. I know it's directly related to how many feet. So yeah, that would be a great option if a 5G pole could cover, or 5 of them could cover the whole town. That would be terrific. But our understanding from the carriers is that doesn't, 5G needs, it's a lower frequency, so they need more of them.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thanks again. So it seems that maybe Gary does not have a strong enough signal to connect to us. So who else is in the waiting room?
Next, we have, it just says Alan.
Hello.
Hello, Alan. Could you give
Yeah.
us you're connected and we're ready to hear from you if you'd give us your address and,
Okay.
and
Yeah,
your
my
last name,
address is
please.
4 Sweet Street, number 7. I live in Dewey Beach as a full-time resident and have for the last 3 years.
And Alan, your last name, please.
Winton, W-I-N-T-O-N.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Property here for 21 years. And I am, I guess, a little late coming to this party because I am just becoming aware of all this. I saw the tower over on Clayton Street. Said, what in the world is that ugly thing doing there. And then I find out you guys are going to string them up all up and down the beach. And I am absolutely floored by the fact that this can be, to me, snuck in by people without any kind of public forum, vote, referendum or something. So people can have the convenience of downloading their funny cat videos on the beach whenever they want to, and at the expense of screwing up the seascape for everybody that comes up and down Dewey Beach and enjoys the ocean and the beachscape. And frankly, who cares about 5G on the beach? Do we even know that the need outstrips the desire of everybody on the East Coast to enjoy a lovely seascape? Or would we rather have towers scattered all over the beach dunes so that we can get a little bit of a faster reception while we're on the beach? The whole idea seems totally cockamamie, totally backwards, the cart pulling the horse. And I'm going to fight this. I don't know what I can do to do it, but I'm going to start looking into this. And I'm going to fight this tooth and nail, screaming all the way to the bitter end. And I'm totally opposed to this whole thing. And if they can't relocate these towers to someplace in a less conspicuous area without destroying the beauty of the natural seashore as we are enjoying it today, then I say let's go back to using landlines. That's all I got to say.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Mr. Winton. Any questions for Alan?
Now, this is Dale Cook. I just want the public in general and Mr. Winton to understand that the town absolutely agrees. We don't want them either. We don't want the placement of them. We have no desire for them. It's because of federal regulations and state regulations that we're required to allow them in, and we're doing everything we can to properly to regulate them. That's all, Mr. Townsend.
Maybe it's time for some civil disobedience. I'm serious about that, because this is absolutely ridiculous to have this rammed down our throats. And that's exactly what's happening.
Thank you, Mr. Winton.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Ashley, anyone else?
Next, we have Rick Judge.
Maybe it's time for some civil disobedience. I'm serious about that.
Rick, you are connected to our meeting, so we're ready to hear from you. If you'd give us your address, please. Thank you. And Mr.
Fred, did you say I was in?
You are in.
You're in.
You have the floor.
All right, didn't want to interrupt Mr. Winton. God bless you, Alan. I couldn't have said it any better. I just had a couple of comments and a quick question. First, I just wanted to remind the commissioners that this ordinance that you're considering, is the town's ordinance. It's to be written to protect the town, and we don't need outside influence to create the verbiage in our town ordinance. Secondly, I live at 10 Chesapeake Street, Ocean Block. I have been an Ocean Block resident full-time in Dewey Beach for probably 45 years. And I have more than adequate Wi-Fi internet coverage in my home, on my street, and on the beach. I don't see any need for further coverage as a necessity for our town or for the networks to get our service. And then I have a quick question. I haven't seen the final version of the ordinance, but is there still a requirement for a distance for a pole from a beach entrance?
The present design standards would prohibit location of a pole within 50 feet of the midpoint of an entrance to the beach.
All right. Thank you, and thank you for all you do, commissioners.
Thanks, Rick.
Any questions for Mr. Judge?
Mr. Judge, this is Mr. Cook. I was just wondering where you are. Are you down in the Caribbean right now?
I wish I was, Mr. Cook. No, I'm in Long Island, New
Well,
York.
we
It's
we
cold
wish
up
you the
here.
best. That's even colder there than it is here.
Got that right.
All
Next,
right.
we have Joanne.
Joanne, could you give us your full name and address, please? And you have the floor.
Sure. Hi. My name is Joanne Fabrizio. We live on Dagsworthy Street, Unit 14 Dagsworthy Street, Units 1 and 2 in the Perch. We actually have a gorgeous view of the Dewey Beach Life Station, and we're super concerned that it's going to be destroyed by this disgusting piece of technology that's going to be right next to it, I think. And I just can't even believe this is even happening to our cute little town of Dewey Beach. We've been homeowners there since 2008. I grew up going to Dewey Beach, and it was always this cute, quaint beach town in Delaware. It's the only one with character of like an old town, lazy beach town. And I'm just really disturbed and upset that this is even happening, that we're letting these big tech companies overrule all of the citizens and homeowners of Dewey Beach. The one comment the AT&T guy said is that they're here to service the beachgoers of Dewey Beach. And I would think that it's the town of Dewey Beach that would want to consider its visitors, not these big tech companies that are coming in. So I just want to state that I'm speaking also for our whole little community, the Perch, that we are all hugely against this. We all look directly at the beach from where we are. We have unobstructed views because of the life-saving station of the beach. And now we are going to have this disgusting, ugly technology just ruining the peaceful and idyllic view that we currently have. And I just wanted to be a part of the call and let you guys know that the folks on Dagsworthy Street are not happy about this, and we are willing to do anything we can to help stop it. I almost feel betrayed by the state of Delaware or whoever is deciding to do this, that it's happening. I was always taught that the US is run by the people. Our towns are run by the people. I think our Constitution says we the people, not we the big tech companies who are slowly taking over this country in every which way. So that's all I really have to say. Just thank you for the opportunity to voice our disgust. But I do speak for the forget how many units, 12 units in the Perch. We are all hugely against this and willing to do whatever it takes to stop these towers on the beach. I forget who it was. I think Bill Zolper raised the point of people are only on the beach for a few hours during the day from June through August, really. Do we really need this technology there when the majority of the people spend most of the time on Route 1? I thought that was a really good point. And the AT&T guy wasn't really impressed by his answer, but that's where we are from the Perch on Dagsworthy. And we know a bunch of people on Dagsworthy. Everyone's just so upset by this.
Thank you, Ms. Fabrizio. Any questions for her? Thanks again.
Next, we have Jeff.
I'm waiting to see Mr. Smith. I take it? Yes. Mr. Smith, you appear to be connected.
Yes,
Could you give us an address and go ahead and begin with your comments, please?
sure. Jeffrey Smith, and I live with my wife at 30 C Strand. So I wanted to back up and look at the big picture in my 3 minutes here. We've already talked about how there are poles that are 15 feet tall that Rehoboth has put or will be putting on existing poles. We've already talked about how Bethany has their poles 4 blocks from the beach. We've already mentioned how South Bethany has no poles near the beach, and neither does Fenwick, neither does Lewis. So we are the unique town, Dewey Beach, to be able to be stuck with these poles, or so it looks. Verizon went in on the dead of winter, and put these poles in. 5 poles at the beach so far. Tilson, a company that's not known as a national carrier, proposes 9 for the beachfront. These are permits that were approved already by DelDOT. We haven't heard from AT&T besides what we heard this morning. The darker winter thing speaks loudly. The size of those poles are unprecedented. The research on LexisNexis and others will find that there is not a single other beach town that has these poles visible from the water's edge. Not one. And we're talking all the way from Pensacola to where Rick Judge is up in the Hamptons, I guess, or somewhere up there, all the way up to Massachusetts, the whole coast. This would not be permitted by any serious town, and it can't be permitted by Dewey. These poles need to be removed and put on Route 1. Let's look at the big picture here, as I promised at the beginning. Dewey Beach has unique views, but not unique to any beach town. It's how we protect those. These poles will be there for 25 years, which will probably outlive some of us if they stay. Totally unacceptable. We are stewards of the beach. There's sky, sand, and sea. A pole does not go with that. And multiple poles don't, because let's be very clear, we're going to have at least 50 to 60% more poles than we have now. So the environmental impact of this is just absolutely absurd, or just, what can make one look at really sky litter. None of us, I hope, throws coffee cups out of a window and litters, and we would look upon shame for anybody that does this. But here's a company, Tilson, and another one, Verizon, that has done that in a more significant way, in something that a highway worker can't even clean up, and that DelDOT allowed that. So this environmental impact has gone beyond anything I've ever seen prior at the beach. It will be visible when we're in the ocean, even though we're not in there now, it's pretty cold, but this will be what you see for the residents. And this is therefore totally unacceptable. Let's be clear, these poles can be moved. Pete Schwarzkopf and Ernie Lopez sponsored the Wireless Infrastructure Act, which was passed by the state in 2017. The FCC was merely issuing interpretive guidance in 2018, which, by the way, was then challenged and aesthetic concerns were upheld. That's a matter of record. These are Pete and Ernie's poles. These should be called Pete and Ernie's poles. And I say, Pete and Ernie, tear down these poles. Let's move them to Route 1. Let's put them where every other town is putting them, because the outrage of this situation will not stop. We can't boycott Verizon and others. That's not going to be effective. But Tilson is a company that's coming in, putting in 9 poles. It's double the number of Verizon on the beach, already permitted. That has to be stopped. DelDOT has to stop it. Pete and Ernie have jurisdiction and oversight responsibilities over DelDOT. DelDOT itself won't be responsive. And my final point on the DelDOT is that DelDOT is so unresponsive. To give a quick example, is that they won't even give the public permits, the copy of the permits that they've issued for Dewey Beach. They sent me a $1,300 bill when I asked for those permits. These are public permits they won't give us. So there's arrogance. There's a lot of money that were donated to certain people on the campaign. Well, that'll all come out. I say Pete Schwarzkopf, Ernie Lopez, tear down these poles. Thank you.
Mr. Jasinski, question for Mr. Smith.
Yeah, so my question actually isn't really just directed at Mr. Smith, although he's taken a lot of time researching this, so he may have some answers. But it's directed to all the public commenters from our Planning and Zoning Commission, as well as the industry representatives who are part of this public hearing. Specifically, I want them and you, Fred, to talk from a technical and legal perspective about distributed antenna systems and why those type of systems from both a legislative point of view, as well as from a technical point of view, can't be used to distribute 5G. There are multiple vendors who do a distributed antenna system. These allow much easier co-location. They're less visually obtrusive. They allow you to extend range and number of transponders and dense user access. And they allow, candidly, the carriers to work together so you don't have the proliferation of all of these poles. They are different than small cells. They're not the same thing as small cells, but they can carry 5G technology. And I want to understand why we don't have this as an alternative. And I invite anyone who was previously speaking to rejoin the public hearing and try to answer the question, either what's the problem with it or why it could be used.
Mr. Smith, do you have any comment related to that?
I guess Mr. Jasinski's point is valid, that there is an issue of technology, and Marty Seitz brought up another issue. Some of those have to be looked at. I mean, there's even that environmental spectrum radiation issue. There are a lot of issues, and a lot of towns are dealing with that. The science is not exactly clear on all of those, as clear as what some of the other issues are. So I think it's definitely a valid issue. I think the issue would be somewhat solved by it being, again, what I'm hearing is that the Route 1 solution is the common location. It's where DelDOT's locating all its other poles instead of east-west streets. You see on Dewey, they're putting them on east-west. So that doesn't answer your question, except for to say that I think that some of these problems would be mitigated because they're highly technical by that Route 1 location. So I'll sign off at that point.
And Mr. Jasinski, I'll just offer quickly a comment. Of course, I don't have the background to answer substantively your question. I will say that I do recall that Mr. Divis's written comments included a recommendation that we strike the definition of distributed antenna system from our ordinance. And I believe he pointed out that it was unnecessary because there weren't any provisions related to those systems in the ordinance or in the design standards. So that's the second question I think we'll have for Mr. Divis or an industry representative before we close the public hearing. Thank you. Looks like Gary Kay is still trying to tie in. Doesn't look like that's going to work for him. Who else is in our?
Next, we have Ben Proctor.
Mr. Proctor, you are connected. If you could give us your address, please, and you can begin your comments.
Yes, good morning. We're homeowners at 12 Houston Street. That's the Ocean Block since 2011.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah, so this is the first time I've ever attended a meeting like this, and it's because I am quite passionate on this subject. I have had some contact with Gary and Dale over the last couple of days. I first want to remark that Jeff Smith, I think, nailed it on the head. And Jeff, I would love to connect with you individually after this, because I liked everything you had to say. So I think what infuriates me the most is learning today that Dewey Beach, we are the only town that has these towers on the beachfront. As you're entering the beach. Bethany, it's 4 blocks back. Rehoboth, using existing infrastructure. Nothing in Fenwick or Lewis, and that's very troubling to me. I can certainly tell you that for Houston Street, I have spoken with all the homeowners, and there isn't one homeowner who would be in favor of these towers being in place where they are. I think everybody here agrees. So I don't want to beat this point to death. There isn't a single person from what I've seen on this call today, whether a town commissioner or whether a homeowner calling in, that wants these towers up. So I don't think we need to. There's no point to debate there. I have 2 questions though. Number one is, based on all the feedback that we've had today, what is the next step? What are you as a group, as the town commissioners, going to do as a result of this call today? Will that include a reach out to Ernie Lopez or Pete Schwarzkopf? It seems that what Jeff had to share is that they're the ones that directly oversee DelDOT, and that they're the ones that have the ability to affect change. Number 2, what would happen if, I heard the term civil disobedience. What would happen if the town said enough's enough and we took those towers down, if we did not get a satisfactory response from DelDOT that they were going to take the towers down? Again, at the end of the day, we're the ones that live there. It's our property, it's our aesthetics, it's what we look at. I don't see how somebody else can come in and do this in the dead of winter. It does remind me of the Baltimore Colts moving out of town back in the dead of winter, back in 1984, when Robert Irsay moved the Colts out. So I really would like to know, everybody is in, there's a unanimous opinion here to have these towers taken out. What is the next step? What is this collective group prepared to do today in order to get the right actions moving forward?
Mr. Proctor, all due respect, this is your opportunity to offer comments, and the commissioners can elect to answer your questions or simply interpret them as comments. I think it's pretty clear what your sentiments are, and what the commissioners are attempting to do is to adopt some criteria which would regulate the placement of these poles, which has been authorized by federal and state law. So the commissioners are in a challenging position here, and they are quite limited in terms of the extent to which they can regulate these activities. But I think your sentiments are very clear and not unlike those of other members of the public, and the commissioners personally may share those to some extent as well. Are there any questions for Mr. Proctor? Mr. Cook?
Yes, Mr. Proctor, thank you very much for dialing in or calling in. I know it's a pain in the neck sometimes. We deal with it constantly as commissioners. What I'd like to make a little bit of a comment and then ask Jim Dede to follow through or follow up on my comment. The biggest difference from Dewey Beach is that 95% of our roadways, of our right-of-ways, belong to the state of Delaware. No other town in Delaware is like that. And that started when the town was first incorporated in 1981. When we found out that Verizon was putting poles in, we immediately called the state of Delaware and said, we got to have a stop to this. Because Verizon said they had permission from Delaware Department of Transportation. The Delaware Department of Transportation said they have the authority, or they are not only have the authority to require the town to allow it, but they have the obligation to require the town to allow it because of federal regulation. And Mr. Dedes, if you could talk about what Mr. Simo from the Department of Transportation said to you and what's gone on since, give him a background on when we went out with inspection, et cetera.
Be happy to, Mr. Mayor. When you and I and our building inspector first got involved in this, actually, we found out not through the state, but Verizon, and immediately contacted DelDOT to find out what was going on. And we ascertained that they had already given approval for all of these sites. And as you related, it was based upon federal and state legislation. And when I talked to Mr. Simo, who is their engineer for DelDOT, that does review these applications per regulatory requirements, his response was we had absolutely no choice based upon the state legislation that was enacted, that the wireless communication companies had the right to install their poles in the public right of way. So it was taken out of our hands completely. And we haven't had any authority, and our research has pretty much ascertained that we really, at this point in time, based upon the legislation, is we have no recourse but to accept what DelDOT has done. They issued the permits, and we're not in a position to recall permits. So we're kind of caught between a rock and a hard spot at this point. So, Mr. Mayor, you're absolutely right that as you mentioned earlier, that the requirements by the state and federal legislation have pretty much empowered wireless communication companies to do what they are doing in the town of Dewey. It is our misfortune that 95% of our streets are controlled by DelDOT, and we don't have control of the right of way. They control it totally. We have 2 streets that we have control of, and we have some limited control over at the life-saving station since we have a lease with Denrec. So those 2 streets are publicly owned by Dewey, and that's the only say that we have, but it is limited because the legislation still requires Dewey to cooperate because it is the public right of way. I hope I've answered your question, sir.
So Mr. Proctor, I just want to, I don't want to say we're throwing up our hands. We're doing everything we can do now. The fact that we're trying to pass this limiting legislation now on where they can place the poles and what equipment they can place is the fact shows that we're not happy with the situation. We have sent out letters and called our local congressmen and called our state reps and sent letters to the governor. We've done almost everything we can do besides chain ourselves to the poles. And I asked what would happen if I did that. Somebody said, well, you wouldn't stop it. You just get your butt locked up. So that might be the next position I take, sitting out there. The problem is they don't really even tell us where. Initially, they didn't even tell us they were bringing the poles in to do it. They just started doing it. We stopped them and they said, no, we have permission. We're very, very frustrated, almost as much as you. And I know you spend a lot of money on a home there where you are, and you don't want the sight line to the beach interrupted with cell towers. One of the problems, and I'll play a little bit of devil's advocate here, is that other towns have a different situation. Dewey's roadways come down from the height of the beach down to the center of town, where, for instance, Rehoboth is flat, and they can put their towers, they can put their antennas on top of existing lampposts on their boardwalk and be already over top of the, over top of the dune height. The equipment supposedly cannot go through dunes or buildings, and they are putting equipment on some of the higher poles on the highway, but they're claiming, and we have no way to disclaim it, is that they have to have something up at the end of the streets above the dune line to get service on the beaches. So I hope that answers what we've been doing and what we're trying to do.
All right. Thank you. If there's Mr. Bauer.
Yeah, and Fred, this is a question for you that no one's asked it yet, but I've heard several people say, there's got to be something we can do. I mean, there is an option where you can sue the FCC, you can sue the federal government. And I know that, we've done some research on that, and it doesn't look like it has positive outcomes, but I just want the public to be aware that that's one of the considerations we have. We know it would cost us millions, but it depends what the appetite is for a fight, I guess.
Hey guys, I have one more question, if I may.
Sure.
Go ahead, Mr. Proctor.
So I think we can all agree the aesthetics, with these streets being most important. I know other towns are struggling with this as well. One just has to do a Google search to see this, whether it's Virginia Beach, Pensacola, etc. If we are going to be screwed by this, and if it ends up being the case where there is nothing we can do, would we have the leverage? All right, would you have the leverage to have them commit capital to soften the aesthetics around these cell towers? And I'm not talking about, what they're doing out in Arizona, the Midwest, where they're making 5G towers look like giant cacti, or out west, giant redwoods. But, certainly think about the aesthetics most certainly of Rehoboth by the Sea. It's beautiful there. Maybe that's perhaps because of the loblollies that soften the entrances there. I've only seen one tower, and that's on Clayton Street, next to the Atlantic Hotel. Obviously, it stands out like a sore thumb. So if we are going to be screwed by this, all right, if we are in fact not able to do anything, would we have the recourse where there could be some type of plantings done that are in the 10 to 15 foot height? Something along the lines of loblollies that would have evergreen or year-round interest that would at least soften that. And I'd welcome any thoughts on that.
Well, I'll just say that we will add that comment to a list of comments, and I don't know if the industry wants to comment on that, if we get Mr. Divis back on, or if there's anyone from Verizon on the line that wants to speak to it. But I can just emphasize or re-emphasize remarks that have been made by a number of the commissioners that just take into consideration that these same issues have resulted in litigation, and the results of that litigation is that the local jurisdictions have very limited authority. It's restricted to aesthetics, and within aesthetics, it's further restricted. So I don't know that it certainly hasn't been put to me before that we should consider requiring that they disguise the poles. But I think we're very limited in terms of what materials we could insist that are used on these poles. So I'm not confident that we would be able to impose upon them a landscaping requirement that included a tree of that size. And I'm not sure if there'd be other consequences of that. Others might object to the tree as well. So we'll take that into consideration as we move along. Ashley, who's next, please?
Next, we have Victoria.
Of that size. And Victoria, can you hear us? If you could turn down your YouTube, you have the floor. Just give us your name and address, please. Ashley, who's next, please?
Next, we have Victoria.
Victoria, I think we can hear you. Could you introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Victoria Carper. I live at 104 West Street. Proud owner of two different properties. The first property we owned.
Victoria, can you hear us?
Oh,
Yes.
Victoria, we are hearing you. If you could turn down your YouTube volume, then
Yeah,
you
I'm
hear
just
the
gonna,
delay.
I'm just gonna escape out of you.
Right.
Did I lose you?
Nope.
We're
no.
here.
Okay, I can't see you anymore, but hopefully you can see me.
We can see
We
you
can.
and we can hear
Okay,
you.
good. Here I am. So my name is Victoria Carper. Been going to the beach, originally Rehoboth, since I was very small. I'm very large now and am old. So over 50 years. And it dismays me to think that our little town is being held hostage because of all these other towns like Rehoboth and Lewis have been able to avoid this. I appreciate the comments of maybe the landscape and the sloping is the reason why we can't have a smarter placement of these horrendous, ugly towers. I met my husband at Dewey Beach and we've been married now for 20 years. So I've been going to Dewey Beach directly since 1998. And my husband and I purchased a condo by the water towers on Bayard Avenue. So I'm familiar with what it's like to move back because you can't afford to be where you really want to be. And it took us 14 years, but we were able to purchase our little bungalow on West Street. And the whole reason for doing that is because we're eventually going to move there. And what I see is our little beach town that I love becoming more like my Washington, D.C. residence, where I am currently working for the federal government. And that changes the whole reason for why we purchased, why we built, and why we want to move and be full-time residents of Dewey. So it really bothers me that our town seems to be being held hostage. I understand there's not much the commissioners can do, but we can't allow this to go forward without a fight. And I believe we need to gather and do some sort of formal disagreement to hold these companies accountable for basically doing this unto us without our knowledge and without our input. So a lot of redundant comments to what you've already heard, but I really think there needs to be some kind of coordination so that you all don't bear the whole burden, but the town really needs to lobby and state the pain that this is causing due to needs that might not even be necessary. So
Thank you, Ms. Carper. Any questions for her? Thanks again. Appreciate your remarks.
keep up.
Fred, that is everyone. We still have 6 individuals in the waiting room who have already spoken, including Mr. Divis. So I can leave them in there for now. I don't know if maybe they're waiting for the next public.
So can you tell whether, other than Mr. Divis, that those people are in the waiting room on this subject or the other?
I sent a message, but I have not heard back yet.
Okay. So commissioners, do you wish to hear from Mr. Divis in response to any of the questions that were raised? Mr. Jasinski?
I would like to hear from him in response to distributed antenna systems.
Mr. Bauer?
Yeah, I would as well.
So if my notes are correct, there were issues raised by Mr. Seitz related to the economics of the technology, that a more costly technology could be more friendly to co-location. What were some of the other questions before we invite him in?
The spectrum of how far a transmitter can go.
All right. I mean, I'll let you ask the questions, of course, but
One lady asked if, why couldn't they put them on the cell towers? On the water tower, and or higher poles on Route 1 rather than along the beach.
Mhm. All right.
Mr. Townsend, I had an email asking me, and I apologize for not knowing the answer, as to why the cell carriers could not have had a contract with various hotels, which are higher and on the beach, and have smaller towers put on top of the hotels, which give them the same amount of coverage, if you think from the Atlantic all the way down. So it was somebody had sent me that email, and I'd be curious about their response to that.
Very good. Anyone else? Obviously, we can develop questions as we hear from Mr. Divis further. So let's invite him in. Welcome back, Mr. Divis. Thanks for staying with us. There were a number of questions raised, and the commissioners have asked you to address them. Do you have any remarks to add for us? Go ahead.
I'm trying to turn off my various feeds here. So if you'll.
We are hearing you.
Okay. I had to turn off the YouTube. Maybe you can throw some of them at me, Mr. Townsend. And I will preface that I am not an engineer, and I am not going to, represent that I have all the answers to every single question. They covered a pretty wide scope of issues, but let's give it a shot.
So, Mr. Divis, one of the principles of the ordinance and the design standards is to encourage co-location, and we have heard on a number of occasions that that's not feasible. And we've heard a question asked or a comment given by one of the speakers that that it may be feasible if a higher class of technology, if you will, is employed rather than a less costly form of technology. Can you comment?
I'm not really sure I've heard that. It sounds a little bit speculative. There is an issue with respect to putting the equipment too close together, and that you don't get the performance that you're investing in when you have small cells. And that's really what we're talking about here, small cells, some of which will deliver 5G service, some of which may deliver 4G service. On the macros, as was discussed, I'm maybe trying to handle a couple questions at once. On a water tank, that's a macro site where the antennas are much larger, and you can distance the antennas away from each other, which is why you can have co-location much more frequently on the macro sites, whether it's a water tank or a freestanding tower or other structure. You can distance the antennas appropriately. With the small cells, it becomes much more difficult, because I guess you could conceivably, but you would have to probably raise the height. And now we're having, you then encounter another issue with respect to that. I would also note that they are really poles when we're talking small cells. I think we say electric poles, utility poles. These are poles like they are in the Dewey Beach community and in many of the beach towns and other towns across the state of Delaware. Please give me some, there were a lot of questions, and I want to make sure that I handle them.
One of them was asked by somebody who inquired of Mr. Stevens whether existing hotels, for instance, could be used as a site for these facilities.
Conceivably, I think, any structures can be. We do co-location on existing buildings in many communities. I can't speak for what other providers have done or not done, or whether they've exhausted or examined those opportunities. As you can understand, I can't speak for the others.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Stevens, you have a follow-up question?
Yeah, Mr. Davis, I apologize because this question may come off more harsh than I mean it, but are we taking the cheapest approach here? Like,
No.
is this the weakest technology in the polls? Because I think Commissioner Jasinski had made a comment. There's upgraded technology that will allow us to not be right on top of the beaches, and understanding the poles are probably cheaper than paying to the hotels, et cetera. So I'm just concerned that I think all of us are in the same opinion. So I'll let you answer the question.
Yeah. Okay. No, it's not. But I thank you for it. It is a complicated subject. There's a lot of nuance and a lot of layers to it. In other, small cells are being utilized across the country in communities and states across the nation. Small cells assist providers from an infrastructure perspective in delivering increased capacity, because traffic is exploding on our networks. Whether we admit it or not, customers are utilizing wireless technology more than they ever have. The pandemic has led to some of that, but those trends have been going on since 2007 in the hundreds of thousands of % increase in traffic. So small cells do assist the macro infrastructure in carrying that traffic. They also create the mechanism and a foundation to provide 5G technology when you're using high frequency millimeter wave spectrum that doesn't propagate the way some of the other spectrum does. It only propagates a short distance, maybe only a block, 2 blocks, because that's the way it works. We can't change how that frequency works. So in some instances, I think depending on what the network needs are and where the other facilities are that a provider has, that is a big part of where small cells will be located to supplement the existing macro infrastructure that's already there. So from a public standpoint, you can't necessarily see how the pieces fit together, but there is a very scientific, engineering-based rationale for where small cell infrastructure is placed so that it delivers the best experience and we can minimize the use or the capital outlay for small cells. On the one hand, these are investments in communities in providing service that customers, whether your constituents or our customers, they're all the same people, they're utilizing the service. But also on the other hand, we are using the latest technology, and I don't think it's a matter of getting off on the cheap with respect to the technology itself. I think in many cases, if we can co-locate on existing structures, we'll do that because it is a cheaper cost than putting in a new pole. But it doesn't always, from the network operational needs, it doesn't always work. So there's a balance of where these have to go, and the search rings are often very limited, where these can go to perform the network function that's necessary. But in other cases, yeah, there's co-location, whether it's a utility pole or something else.
Mr. Divis,
it's a long-winded way of answering your question.
Mr. Divis, a number of your more general comments may have been referencing a question that we had earlier, but could you specifically speak to the issue of use of distributed antenna systems?
I will preface my answer that I am not an engineer. And so my understanding and experience is that DAS systems are generally used in indoor or in outdoor stadium or where significant gatherings of college campus, say in the green at say University of Delaware or Benjamin Franklin Parkway in Philadelphia. DAS is often a very specific utilization of wireless technology in areas where there are gatherings of significant I can only tell you that from a small cell perspective, and from this perspective, it is a tool in the toolbox, but is not always an appropriate tool to use when working in a town where you have the spreading out of where you're going to need to hit a coverage or a capacity concern. So that's the best way I can answer that at this point.
Mr. Persinger, did you
No,
just lean up? Okay.
No, I just leaned up. I did not have a question.
Okay, gotcha. Understand. Mr. Stevens?
Yeah, I don't think I heard the answer to my question. Do you have situations, Mr. Divis, in which you've put these 5G cells on top of buildings?
I will go back, Commissioner, and say small cells are the functional term. Sometimes they do 5G, sometimes they do 4G. And I think that's important because a lot of the small cells that AT&T is putting in are 4G, and they're really capacity. That's the function that they are serving, is handling the capacity. They are like off ramps for our network. I'm trying to think of some of our other deployments. I think, and I will say, I think they can be, and I think we have done that. So I don't think it's something that is off the table with respect to small cells, but certainly to do that, they would have to meet the coverage aims that we're trying to get from that small cell. So I think in theory, yes, you could do that. Whether it works in every instance is probably not the case, and it's all it can be all very situationally dependent.
I guess I don't understand how, if you're on top of the building, it may not work, but if it's a pole in the middle of a community, it would work.
I think it all depends. It all depends. I'm sorry, Commissioner, but it really does. You have to know what type of coverage, what type of situation that particular node is trying to achieve with respect to serving customers and delivering network service, where it's located, the height that we're looking at, and the general proximity of coverage you're trying to get. Those are all factors that go into whether a building is too high or too low, whether a pole is in the right place or not. It really is situation dependent on what the network objective is to better serve our customers and deliver the wireless service.
Mr. Bauer.
Yeah, Mr. Divis, I've heard a little bit from the public that the deployment of what we're getting in Dewey Beach is unlike what's going on in Lewis and Bethany and other towns. Can you speak to that? Are we getting a different deployment than other towns, or are we getting the same treatment?
No, I think we at least AT&T, and I think the other carriers, we have a finite amount of capital each year to use to deploy infrastructure and enhance our network to improve service to our customers. So we're not going to be going to every town at the same time, whether it's in Delaware or in California or Texas or wherever. We are not, as you know, AT&T right now, we have not approached Dewey, to my knowledge, for any small cells. We have in other towns. So it's where my company may be in our network plans for a given year will be different from others. So we may be talking to one town and not another, where another company is talking to that town but not the other. So it really it may be that the network needs are not as profound in one town versus another.
Mr. Bauer.
Davis, can you speak to, obviously you're on a call here with us, so there must be a plan for you to come to Dewey Beach at some point, or else you wouldn't be spending your time here on a call with us, as much as you like us, but.
Well, no, I think we're also interested in good policy and ordinances that, are balanced between, community sensibilities and robust connectivity. And so probably at some point, we will probably be having another conversation. But I also think that we take an interest in working with communities and at least being part of the discussion.
I do give you credit for that. I wish Verizon and Tilson were also engaged in these calls as well. What is the project you've done down in Bethany and Fenwick?
I don't think at this point we have engaged either of those towns from AT&T. We have worked in Rehoboth. We have a number of small cells in Rehoboth that utilize a couple of different strategies. Whether it's replacing existing poles. We do have a couple freestanding, but right now, some of what our network needs, like I said, may be different than some of the other providers, and how we're balancing out our capital allocation for different needs, whether it's across other communities in the state of Delaware or elsewhere. Rehoboth for us, I think, is the best example of the work we've done in small cells.
That would be probably a good project for us to research of how other carriers have done those other surrounding towns.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for your time.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Anyone else with a question for Mr. Divis? Mr. Cook.
Mr. Divis, a couple a thought and a question. Question first. You all are in Rehoboth now, going down Rehoboth Avenue. Is that correct?
Yes.
I think in Verizon is on the boardwalk.
I don't want to speak for somebody else. We do have a facility or two on the boardwalk, as well as Rehoboth Avenue.
From what I've seen in the news and read in the newspaper, you have existing facilities on the highway style poles going down Rehoboth Avenue, and Verizon was putting them in a modified type structure on the boardwalk to make it look like their existing lamppost. I guess I would say, number one, I'm going to say again too, also they did put a wooden pole on one block further off the boardwalk, and I can't remember the name of that block now, but in Rehoboth. So Rehoboth is in the process of getting wooden poles also, like we are. But I guess the further you go back from the ocean, the higher up you need to place your equipment. Is that correct? So that it has a direct line to the beach or to the area it's servicing?
It all depends, Mr. Mayor, what the objective is for a particular site and where the coverage or capacity need. And I want to stress the capacity issue with respect to how much traffic is increasing on a daily basis on our networks. Oftentimes, small cells, you only want them to cover a small area, whether for capacity or coverage. The higher you make them, the wider they cover. So it again goes back to how the piece parts fit with the macros that are already in service, and then the small cells, and where you may be exhausting a sector of a macro cell, and you need to have a way to offload that traffic, which is often a small cell. So it may just be a very specific area, and you're just covering a small area in that, in that location. Whether if you're talking 5G, then sometimes different dynamics play. But the height is always very important, because the lower the height, the smaller the coverage area or the area the signal will propagate. The higher you go, the wider it goes. So it all depends on what the engineers are trying to accomplish to continue to move the real, floods of data that are coming through our network.
Gotcha. I just, maybe Mr. Dedes can back me up on the next statement. Once I asked the provider if they could put it on a building on the front of the ocean, like Mr. Stevens suggested, and they were very evasive, in my opinion, and then said, "Oh, it's possible," and then said that the building's infrastructure, because it was an older building, wouldn't hold the equipment properly in a storm, and that the equipment then would go over the 35-foot height limit of the existing building that the town had. Mr. Dedes, am I remembering that correct?
You are, Mr. Mayor, you're remembering it very correctly. Our sense of that communication is there was no interest whatsoever, even when we had that discussion. I think there's another issue when you involve co-locating on other buildings. There's leases that have to be, I guess, incorporated in installation, and our provider that came to us, I sense there was no interest in getting involved in a co-location. They made that pretty clear to us.
Yeah, and Mr. Dedes, again, when we talked about co-location, they said we'll start thinking about that. If we can go up 50 feet on our poles rather than the 35 feet, then we'd have the room to co-locate. So it was sort of where. Go ahead.
No, I think you're right. We made it very clear. We have a 35-foot height restriction in the town, and we didn't want to exceed that. But I'll be quite honest, after our discussion, I think even if we put it up 50 feet, I don't think they would be interested in co-locating.
Okay. So thank you, Mr. Townsend. I appreciate your having me question.
Thank you. Mr. Diviso, I want to thank you again for spending so much time with us today. It's very
Mr. Townsend, Mr. Jasinski had his hand up.
I see that. I'm going to go.
I'm sorry. Okay.
I'm going to go to him, and I've got a follow-up question as well. But Mr. Jasinski.
Sure. I just wanted Mr. Dennis to confirm that a distributed antenna system is possible to be installed outside. It may not be desirable, but certainly distributed antenna systems can be installed in campus-like environments outdoors.
And I'll begin his answer by saying that he professes not to be an engineer, but go ahead and give us.
No, I'm not an engineer, and coverage objectives are very situationally dependent. So while I would think yes is the answer to that question, it doesn't necessarily mean that that is a deployment that it works in situations, like what we're speaking about now.
All right, thank you. Anything more, Mr. Jasinski, along that line? Mr. Divis, you had commented regarding the area limitation for cabinets and equipment, which can be found in the cabinets and equipment section of the design standards under subsection H. Currently reads shall not exceed 28 cubic feet in volume and shall not exceed 3 feet in height. I take it that the 3 feet is insufficient for your equipment. I think you indicated that 4 feet is minimally required.
I believe that is what we did put in our communication.
And that you didn't include a reference to an acceptable cubic foot requirement.
I think we referenced the FCC small cell order and those dimensions.
So you're asking for 15 by 4. I believe.
I'm going to go back into the document. Let's see.
15 inches by 4 feet.
I believe that is correct as I'm looking at the document. Yes, sir.
Okay. There may be, I don't know if there are additional follow-up questions, but Mr. Divis, you've heard a lot. Some of it I'm sure you've heard before, but do you have any other comments you'd like to offer at this time of your own?
No, I appreciate the opportunity that you've afforded me to answer questions and engage with the commissioners and to be part of the process. Again, I think we, there is a respect for community sensibilities, and while we've heard a lot of comments today, I do think there is, we are. This is about investing in communities and their connectivity. And I think if there wasn't a need, we'd be deploying our capital elsewhere. So I do respect everyone's opinion today, and I thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you. Mr. Zolper, you have a question from?
Yeah, just a follow-up to Mr. Smith, some of Mr. Smith's comments. So some of the other communities along the coast, it's true they're not going up on the beach. I think Fenwick Island, what they did was work with the telecommunication company and actually address the height requirements in their town of Fenwick Island, and actually changed it so they could have the poles high enough on Route 1 to hit the beach without putting poles on the beach. Now, they do have one pole that's in the county area, I think north of Fenwick Island, that is up on the beach, but the rest of their poles, they raised the height limit of those poles on Route 1 to reach a beach. So I just throw that out there. I don't know if that's an option, but that's something maybe, it may be too late, but that was something maybe we should look at in the future. Thank you.
I know that Mr. Dedes has commented on that, speculating that the industry does not favor placing a pole at a higher height from a distance further away than these beach locations. Mr. Divis, is there anything more you can say about that?
I think it really all depends on what the objectives are of the infrastructure that we're planning on, and what the coverage is, what technology, spectrum is being used, frequencies, things like that. So while things may work in one instance as they may not work in another, it really does become situationally dependent. And I may sound like a broken record, and I apologize, but it really is, it can be different among carriers as to what the needs are to continue to expand and enhance the provision of service.
So, Mr. Zolper, it might be interesting to know whether those poles are carrying 5G technology versus 4G technology that you're referring to.
Yes, sir, they are carrying 5G. I think the big difference is the mayor pointed out, I think Fenwick owns their streets, and so their option was to put them along State Route 1.
Anything more before we close this public hearing? Seeing none, Mr. Mayor, I'll turn the meeting back over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Townsend. We've had the public hearing and heard the, if you want to call it evidence, the discussions back and forth about the proposal. We would now go to action item number 1, discuss and possibly vote to approve an ordinance to amend Chapter 185 Utilities Code of the Town of Dewey Beach, Delaware, by adding thereto a new section relating to the regulation of wireless facilities. And you had the suggested ordinance was posted yesterday. I would ask if there's any motion or discussion that you would like to have first, and then a motion. Either way, Commissioner.
I'll move for discussion purposes that we consider the ordinance as proposed.
Move to
Second.
consider and who's the second?
I'm second.
Commissioner Bauer, second. Commissioner Jazinski, motion to accept the ordinance. Commissioner Jazinski, since it was your motion, did you want to discuss?
Yeah, so it looks to me, if we're going to take the ordinance as it's proposed, that we have to make that change on the 100, 300 feet. I think there was one other thing, and we'd certainly want Fred to recommend specifically what we do there. I threw out the whole thing with distributed antenna systems because I'm not an expert on the technology, and I'm certainly not an expert on the law as well, whether the law requires us to do small cell, or if we're allowed legally to require distributed antenna systems. And the reason I brought it up is that people originally put these distributed antenna systems indoors. It was a way to kind of expand range. Then they started using them in stadiums. Like, how do you get 30,000 people in a stadium? But they are also used outdoors. And AT&T themselves, I found it on their own website, did for in Atlanta for a big event. And they didn't just do it temporarily, they did it permanently. They did a hybrid of distributed antenna systems and small cell. And the advantage of the distributed antenna systems is what's above ground and what you see on the pole is less obtrusive, so they're less objectionable. The carriers share the infrastructure, and then the antennas or the poles kind of go back to one set of infrastructure. So it has less impact on the community. Carriers tend not to like it because it costs a little bit more. They also have to kind of work together. My real question is, and I, really kind of apologize, Fred, but can we both technically and legally potentially require people to use this technology, which may mitigate the impact to the community?
Who's that question to?
Really for Fred.
Well, it's an interesting question. I can tell you that we have our current ordinance does not speak to it as a requirement. Number two, our current ordinance was not drafted from thin air. Our ordinance and the design standards have been modeled after those in our neighboring towns. I've not been asked this question before, considered it, but I'd be very skeptical that we could say at this point in time that we can prohibit the installation of these poles and require use of a different technology. I would be shocked if that was the result, because these aesthetic concerns have been raised and have been the guts of some pretty significant litigation, and I doubt that there is a simple answer like that.
I appreciate it. I appreciate that. So.
Mr. Stevens.
Yeah, when I look at the, I'm just following up a little bit on David Jazinski's comment of how to get a little bit creative. In this section, it does say, and I'm just curious, Fred, we have permit fees, permit fee for each wireless facility covered by the permit shall be, it's an open issue. Is there any limitation on what we can charge and how frequently we can charge the carriers for those fees?
Well, permit fees are designed to be one time.
No, I understand that, but
and additionally, that there needs to be a nexus between the administrative effort involved in reviewing the permit and the permit fee. It's not permit fees cannot be like a source of general revenue. They're designed to offset the expense related to reviewing the application. So there are limitations.
Yeah, I'd say there's been a lot of expense on the town level to these 5Gs overall, not just on the permit process.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Dedes, did you want to address what the fee cost is for the permits?
Yes.
Does it relate to the rest of the building permits the same way?
We have received permits from Verizon and Tilson. and the permits that are based upon the construction costs and their installation, and they've broken it down. And for example, and I will just throw this out, if the fee is $50,000, we would charge 3%, similar to any construction that already exists in our charging, in the permission for us to charge in our code. So we're going by 3%.
Right. So, which is the same cost for other building permits.
That's correct.
So, Mr. Dedes, if I may interrupt, I'm sorry, Mr. Cook, are you suggesting that we make reference to our existing permit fees at subsection 10 or section 10 of this ordinance as opposed to?
I think that would be the correct way, because it really is pretty much a one-time fee. And it's tied into the construction costs, and that's what we have actually billed Verizon for when they've applied for permits.
All right, Mr. Townsend, I have a question. If we were to vote in this ordinance now, does it also include that same vote? Would that involve the design standards for small cell wireless facilities also?
I would recommend that we address the design standards first by a vote, and then follow that up with a vote on the ordinance.
All right, we had a motion. I believe Mr. Jazinski's motion was to accept the ordinance, and
So
that's what we're just.
Yeah, so I'll withdraw that motion, and instead put in a motion to accept the design standards with the changes that Mr. Townsend will recommend to us.
Commissioner Bauer, you were the second for the original motion. Do you agree to that?
I agree to that.
And you second this motion?
Yes.
We have a proper motion and a second on the floor, I believe then. Correct, Mr. Townsend?
We do. I'll just point out that this is a little bit of a unique situation. So for the design standards to be implemented, we've got to adopt the ordinance. So we can, what we're doing now is we're settling on the design standards form, and then we're going to vote presumably on the ordinance after that.
Well, then on the design standards, Mr. Townsend, the only thing that I remember off the top of my head that you wanted to change or delete was in the placement of and siting of small wireless facilities, item number B, all new wireless shall be a minimum of 300 feet from another small cell antenna wireless equipment. You wanted to either change or eliminate that.
I think my recommendation is that we eliminate that, because that standard is addressed elsewhere, but it's addressed with a 100-foot limitation. We needed to include an exception in the siting prohibitions language that suggested that for co-location, those siting prohibitions don't apply. I think that's understood. We want to encourage co-location, not discourage co-location. And we heard from Mr. Divis that the size of the cabinets that AT&T uses are in excess of the limitation we have in subsection H of the cabinets and equipment. And he's asking that be reworded to allow for a 4-foot cabinet by 15 inches, as opposed to the limitation of 28 cubic feet and 3 feet in height. So
you would suggest then changing item H in cabinets and equipment to shall not exceed whatever amount of cubic feet, and the volume shall not exceed 4 feet by 15 feet.
15 inches, but that's not really so much of a suggestion of mine. Just I wanted to point out that that's a substantive change that AT&T is seeking. I just didn't want that to be forgotten.
So with those two changes, then would the motion have to be adjusted?
So what I would suggest is that the motion include and I think the motion already indicates that we're anticipating a couple of changes, and they are once again. So if you pass the motion, the motion would be to eliminate subsection B, to include in the citing prohibition section a exception for co-location. So the distance between equipment shall not apply in a co-location. And then it's up to this group whether you wanted to modify your cabinet size restriction.
Well, just a minute, Mr. Bauer, I'll be right with you. What is your suggestion then for that cabinets and equipment, item 8? What would you suggest as
I don't have a particular legal perspective on that. That is just simply I just wanted to point it out. So this group could consider doing that or not.
So I'm trying to find a picture of it, but I don't think the cabinets that are proposed on the 5G poles that are going with the lighting fixtures in Rehoboth are greater than 3 feet in height. So I'm wondering what AT&T is using versus what the other provider is using in Rehoboth that allows them to be such different sizes.
Yeah, I don't know. We did put that question to Mr. Divis, and he just simply offered up that his comment was that their cabinets are projected to be 4 feet in height and 12 inches deep.
Mr. Bauer, did you have a comment about this item?
Yeah, no, I don't think I've heard anybody complain about the size of the transmitters on it. It's more so the poles at the end of the street. So I don't personally have an issue with it. Fred, the course we follow here, since David initially made the motion and I seconded it, we have to redo that motion, or do we need a new motion?
The motion was changed to cover the design standard to begin with. And then Mr. Townsend, if I understand correctly, you said with the understanding of the exceptions that you put in and the exception that Mr. Jasinski is talking about now would be included.
I would say that if we pass the motion as it is, it will not adjust the cubic feet limitation at subsection H of cabinets and equipment. So the current motion would be to allow a co-location exception from the citing prohibitions and to delete subsection B of placement and citing, which is redundant.
So, Mr. Bauer, did that solve your question?
Yep.
I will modify my motion to include Fred's 2 items there. So.
Yep. And I'll second that.
You don't have to second. So item 8, Mr. Townsend, we would not change at this time?
Well, that's up to this group. I was just pointing it out. So I don't have a legal perspective on that. That's more of a substantive question.
Mr. Jasinski, did you want to address that or not?
Mr. Dennis didn't bring it up in today's meeting, the cabinet size. He had brought it up in some previous comments, but we haven't heard from any other provider that this is an issue. So I tend to think that this is just, they have a selection of multiple types of equipment and that there are ones that fit within it. They just happen to perhaps use one that's larger.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So motion on the floor is to accept the design standard for small cell wireless facilities and telecommunications with the 2 items that Mr. Townsend, excuse me?
Mr. Persinger is asking to be recognized.
Mr. Persinger, I'm sorry.
That's fine. This is fairly minor. And I guess one substantive question. There are a couple of places in here where the wording needs to be clarified. It's just, it just doesn't make sense as it's written. One's fairly minor, but there's one section that says, I can't find it now. All new wireless equipment shall, no, it's not that one, sorry. Equipment and new shall be in alignment with other poles and street furniture. It's just, without putting it into the motion, is there an opportunity to clarify things like that as you finalize the final wording of this before it's posted for official recognition.
As long as it's non-substantive, the codifier, if you will, can correct typographical errors.
Okay, I think those are basically non-substantive. The other question I have is exactly where are we with respect to the the minimum of 100 feet from another small cell antenna or wireless equipment? I'm not sure exactly where that's going and how it's going to be described.
If I understand, Mr. Townsend, that was left at 100 feet. Is that correct?
Under the new structure section A, the second bullet of A includes a 100-foot restriction.
Right. Is that what you wanted, Mr. Persinger, or do you have a problem with that? Or?
I don't necessarily have a preference. I mean, I'm fine with 100 feet, but when you say the second bullet under A, I'm not sure where you're talking about.
Under new structure. So there are multiple headings. So on my third page, the top of my third page has a heading, new structure.
Okay.
You see the second bullet under subsection A?
I do. So.
And this is another codifier issue. I don't think we need a subsection A if we don't have a subsection B. So the codifier could replace those bullets with subsection designations, and it'd be a little bit easier.
So then the sighting prohibition below would be deleted. All new wireless equipment shall be a minimum of 100 feet from another small cell antenna wireless equipment.
Well, I'm sorry, could you repeat your question?
Well, yeah, I mean, the second bullet under A, which may be changed in terms of its labeling, that would remain.
That remains.
But then the sighting prohibition A, that's just below that, that says all new wireless equipment shall be a minimum of 100 feet from another small cell antenna wireless equipment. Is that something that should remain? I mean, that sounds like that would prevent co-location on the same pole.
Yeah, that's where the exception that I referred to is going to go in there, saying that this does not apply in the instance of, this restriction does not apply in the instance of co-location.
Okay, all right, I see. And then the 300 feet would be deleted in the earlier. Okay,
right.
All right, that's all I had. Thank you.
Are there any other questions concerning this discussion? Hearing none, I'll call the question. All in favor of the item, say aye.
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 All against, say nay. Any abstentions? Actually, that's unanimous then. We have accepted with modifications, we accepted the design standards for small cell wireless facilities and telecommunications towers. Now we go to, as I understand it, Mr. Townsend, we go to the ordinance, an ordinance to amend chapter 185, section 90, utilities of the code of the town of Dewey Beach, Delaware, by adding thereto a section 90A relating to the wireless facilities. Is that correct, Mr. Townsend?
Yes.
Do I hear a motion in order to discuss?
Motion.
Motion by Mr. Bauer to accept the ordinance.
Second.
Second by Mr. Jazinski. Mr. Bauer, since you made the motion, would you like to discuss first?
No, Fred, can you give us a little background on it?
Just simply that the design standards are where the individual restrictions are meant to appear. And this is the way that these ordinances are structured in other jurisdictions. This is the authorizing ordinance that allows for the establishment and enforcement of design standards. So there are a lot of definitions in here. A good deal of it is definitional. We did talk about subsection 10 and how, were we to adopt this, we would make reference to the appropriate building code permit fee provision. So that's one change that would need to be made. So I think that the controversy is really relates to the design standards more so than the ordinance that authorizes it in these.
No, I mean, it looks very complete to me, so, you know, I have no further comment at this point.
Thank you, Mr. Bauer. Mr. Jazinski, since you seconded,
I don't have any additional comments on the ordinance itself.
does anybody else have any additional comments? Mr. Persinger?
Yeah, I do have some comments, questions. Back to basically to the top of the ordinance under paragraph 2B, town reviews of installation or maintenance of wireless facilities covered by federal or state legislation are confined to the procedures and limits on review and approval for siting, co-locating, and modifying wireless facilities, et cetera. And then the last sentence there, applications that include changes to or new wireless facilities not specified by federal or state laws will be subject to additional town review procedures, guidelines, and fees. Can you distinguish between those two categorizations? It's not clear to me what would fall into the first sentence versus what would fall into the last sentence. And this is directed to our town attorney.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm not aware of what that distinction is between wireless facilities that are not specified by federal or state laws versus wireless facilities that are covered by federal and state legislation. So it's kind of it's a technical question relating to, I guess, the technology that the industry employs. So I am not in a position to describe the meaning of that distinction.
Well, it seems that we are, in some sense, in terms of our ability to have some influence over the location of these utility poles, we are considerably hamstrung by both state and federal legislation.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, what I'm trying to understand here is whether or not all of the provisions that we have in here for required review and perhaps even conditional use permits are really not applicable to most of the situations that we're most concerned with. Because, you know, it would seem if we're in fact hamstrung already by the state and federal laws and regulations, that all of these situations would fall into that first category, and that perhaps most of what is in our ordinance would not be applicable or enforceable with respect to those situations.
Well,
Mr. Townsend, if I read that correctly, the last sentence there says any wireless facilities other than those like we are looking at now that are regulated by federal and state law might include additional review by the town. Is that correct?
right.
Go ahead, sir.
I believe it is correct. The first section the first sentence acknowledges our right to review and approve for siting and co-location wireless facilities and equipment that are described in state and federal regulations. The second section allows us to regulate changes to or new wireless facilities that are not specified, defined, what have you, by federal or state laws. I don't know what those might be. I think this is just saying that we've got the authority to employ the restrictions called on or called for by the federal and state legislation in the first instance, and what is not regulated or specified by federal and state laws in the second instance, we also have the right to review and impose guidelines and procedures and fees. So,
pardon me, Mr. Persinger, I think the way I read it, again, we're limited by how we can review in the first sentence because of state and federal law. And the last sentence that says, and anything else that is not covered by federal and state law, we then have the ability to review under additional standard.
I understand that the issue here is that we have a whole set of requirements and provisions and review standards that we've established in the rest of this ordinance. Are they fully consistent with the federal and state regulations that govern all of the situations, all the wireless facilities in that first sentence? Because if they're not, then do they really have any meaning?
Well, the outcome of the litigation is that the local authorities have the right to impose aesthetic regulations on this industry, and that's what we're doing. So,
well, I think it goes. I mean, we are doing that in a sense. I think it goes beyond that. We have a number of requirements in here about administrative review and even conditional use permits in some cases. Co-location, there is some requirement in here that the applicant for a new wireless facility would have to prove in some sense that there was not a co-location opportunity that could be taken advantage of. And so I'm just trying to get a sense of how consistent that is with existing state and federal regulation, because that's really what we're up against, and the extent to which we can really enforce that.
Well, but if I may interrupt again, I apologize, but doesn't that open up whatever comes down the road in the future? We would be able then to regulate it by this ordinance.
Well, I'm not sure of that. If whatever comes down in the future is subject to state and federal regulations.
Well, it could be.
You still have the question of whether the extent to which our ordinance is applicable to those situations and can be enforced.
Do you have another suggestion that you might come up with?
I do not. I mean, again, it was directed to the town attorney, so we could understand really.
I apologize.
What the practical implications are of having an ordinance like this in place. And the response I heard was that it's largely with respect to aesthetic considerations, and I think the ordinance goes beyond that.
Mr. Stevens, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I guess when I read that, Gary, what I read was that if the wireless company decided to make a change, it would have to go through a normal process of our review. I didn't see that as an exclusionary item that would violate everything else. So if I am Verizon and I want to make X, Y, and Z, it still has to go through the process, even though the federal and state have not mandated that change. That's how I read that. And I don't know if you're reading it the same way or not.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I read it similarly. This is acknowledging that the town has review authority over wireless facilities that are otherwise or also described and covered by state and federal legislation. So the first sentence acknowledges that we have authority to review and apply existing federal and state legislation, and additionally other requirements that don't conflict with federal and state legislation. And then if federal and state legislation it turns out for some reason, and I can't envision a scenario where that would be, not to cover a proposed change or installation of a new wireless facility, that we are not restricted by the existence of federal and state legislation, and that our own criteria could be enforced in those instances. I think the second sentence, and I understand the confusion, is very unlikely to come into play. The first sentence, though, of subsection 2B does acknowledge the town's right to review these installations. And I think that's what you're concerned about. Do we have the right or not? And we do.
No, I'm not concerned. My concern is that our right to review is confined to the procedures and limits on review and approval for siting, co-locating, and modifying wireless facilities and equipment as defined by those regulations. So, it does limit our ability And then my question was, a lot of the requirements or the requirements that follow in the ordinance, the extent to which they are not consistent with the regulations and the legislation that have already been promulgated federally or on a statewide basis. Does that make it impossible for us to enforce some of those requirements that we have later on in the ordinance? So I can leave it at that. I know I'm just trying to understand a little bit better what the limitations are of being able to apply the ordinance.
Mr. Towns, do you want to make one last comment on that?
Yeah, one last comment, just that, if you were to eliminate section 2B, or at least the first sentence of 2B, I don't think it would change anything. It's simply acknowledging that whatever it is that we do in the process of reviewing these installations, it has to be consistent with existing federal and state legislation. So it's more of an acknowledgement that there are a couple other layers of regulation that we are confined by in the course of adopting our own.
Could I ask one other question?
Yes, sir. No problem.
I promise this will be my last question.
No problem.
Paragraph 3A, II, wireless facilities shall not be permitted on the beach dunes or east of the beach dunes. I'm wondering how this relates to the supplemental agreement with DelDOT, which I think we're going to consider at some point this morning or this afternoon now. And I guess the concern here is what is defined as east of the beach dunes, and is there something that really gives us the authority to regulate that area?
The state and federal legislation that authorizes these installations that have.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm taking. Never mind. It says. I withdraw my question. Never mind. I was reading that incorrectly.
Thank you very much.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Go
ahead. I have another question. I'll come back later.
Are there any other questions from any other commissioner about the ordinance? Mr. Townsend.
I just wanted to remind everyone that in the context of the question that was asked, it's the right-of-ways, the existence of the right-of-ways that serves as a location for these utilities. And were it not for the right-of-ways, then we might not be here. So these beach dunes and areas east of the beach dunes are not within the right-of-way, and therefore we are expressly prohibiting location of wireless facilities in those areas.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I pointed to the wrong section. I was really thinking more about the ability of a wireless provider to put a utility pole upon beach lands. And I think the definition of beach lands is relevant to that supplemental agreement, which we're going to talk about at some point this afternoon.
Okay.
So are we all right? Did you get your answer?
Well, I'm not sure. I'm not sure what our ability is to regulate what is beach land, what the definition of beach land is. We had some confusion when we talked about this last time about where beach lands begin. On the westernmost definition of beach lands. And there was that 8-foot section between what we thought was the beginning of the beach land and the end of the road surface. And I think that's probably where some poles are already erected at this point. Does any of this change our ability to regulate the placement of poles in that area?
I think a better way of looking at this is that these poles can be sited in the right-of-way and not outside the right-of-way. And then the agreement that we're going to talk about a little later on is defining the right-of-way and attempting to define the right-of-way as being 8 feet from all paved surfaces. So I don't know that we need to worry too much about defining beach lands or defining the dunes and beach areas because it would be a non-starter if an industry provider wished to locate a pole outside of a public right-of-way.
Does that answer your question, Mr. President?
Yeah, I think so. Yes.
Thank you very much. The other question from, or statements about the vote on this, chapter 185, section 90?
No.
I call the question then. All those in favor of accepting it, say aye.
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 Any against, say nay. Any abstention? The vote passes unanimously. Mr. Townsend.
I think it's understood that we're going to make a adjustment to the language of paragraph 10 regarding permit fees just by making an internal reference to our building permit criteria.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I just wanted to state that for the record. All right.
Okay, so that's on the record. Thank you very much. So we've now covered item number 1, and we're only 2.5 hours into the meeting. How about that, sports fans? Public hearing on ordinance to amend chapter 167 of the Dewey Beach Code of Ordinances regarding taxes to impose a lodging tax on hotels, motels, and tourist homes. Mr. Townsend, you can take over the public hearing.
I will. Ashley, is there anyone?
So there are 5 individuals in the waiting room right now. 5 of the same individuals who spoke earlier public hearing. I did send a message to see if they would like to speak for the second one, but I haven't heard back. Would you like me to bring each of them in one at a time to see if they are just sitting from the previous, or if they would like to speak?
I think we probably have to. We can't decide for them what
Okay.
subject they want to speak to.
Okay, it's down to 4 now.
I need to go to the printer real quick and I'll be right back.
The first one, Dale, is Marty Seitz.
All right, Mr. Townsend will be right back. He's going to run the public hearing. He is back. They're attempting to bring Marty Seitz up.
Very good. Mr. Seitz, can you hear me?
Yeah, yes. I'm still on YouTube.
Okay, so you are connected to our meeting on the subject of the lodging tax. Could you turn the volume down on your YouTube feed? And then you can go ahead and begin with your comments if you have any.
Yeah, no. Yeah, I don't have any comments.
Okay, very good. So you were in the waiting room, and that's why we just called on you to see if you wish to speak on this issue. We're back to the public hearing stage. So thank you very much. So I can see this is going to be a little awkward, but I think we have to go through it.
Okay, next is Joanne. I believe her last name, Fabrizio.
Ms. Fabrizio? Are you there, Ms. Fabrizio? So she probably doesn't even know she's in the waiting room. So let's go ahead to the next.
The next would be Alan Winton.
Mr. Winton, can you hear me? Mr. Winton? Yeah. So
And
let's.
that was the one. The other 2 that were in there did drop out. So
Oh, they
that's-
did. So there's no one in the waiting room, and there doesn't appear to be anyone who wishes to be heard on this, and no one from industry, so to speak.
Correct.
Okay, well, Mr. Mayor.
Yes, sir.
We've opened the public hearing, and there does not appear to be any public who wishes to speak on the issue of the lodging tax ordinance.
So do you want to?
We can close the public hearing.
Then we will close the public hearing and go to item, which is listed as item number 3, discuss and possibly vote to approve an ordinance to amend chapter 167 of the Dewey Beach Code of Ordinances regarding taxes to impose a lodging tax on hotels, motels, and tourist homes. And any comments or questions from the commissioners? First off, Mr. Jazinski.
Well, for purposes of discussion, move that we consider this ordinance.
You're moving to accept the ordinance?
Yeah, so we can discuss it. Yes, absolutely.
For discussion. Is it- Mr. Persinger, second. Mr. Jazinski, since it's your initial vote, go ahead and discuss.
The question I have when I look through it, it looks like the way this is written now, if we accept it as is, that would be an April 1 date. Is that correct, Fred, or am I misinterpreting that?
I believe the effective date language on the
Actually, it's blank, so I guess we have to accept it with an effective. We have to put an effective date in it to accept.
That's correct.
Okay.
And if you eliminated any reference to an effective date, it would by law be made effective immediately. So you need to insert one.
Okay, so I'll go ahead and based on the feedback, even though no one joined the public hearing, the feedback we've gotten on this. What I would put forward is, I think we've been considering this for quite a while as a town. I think it's ultimately the right thing to do. I think April 1st is a little early, given the economic situation of the hotels this spring, with things still partially shut down, town entertainment venues not at full capacity. But I do think within the next fiscal budget year, it should be in place at some point. So what I would say is, I think the effective date should be no earlier than July 1st and no later than January 1st. And I'm hoping that there'll be a sense among the commissioners that it's the right thing to do it, and we can come to some kind of understanding about what the right date is to go ahead and make this effective.
All right, Mr. Persinger, you second the motion. Do you want to? Discuss it?
I don't think Mr. Jazinski made an official amendment to his motion. If he wanted to consider something, I mean, I would support January 1 as a specific date. I think we have to put a specific date in there. So, I mean, it's not up to me to change the motion. That would be up to Mr. Jazinski. I do have some other comments about the.
Actually, I was asking you, since you were the second to the original motion, to discuss the original motion in general.
Okay, well, let me do that then. I have some questions about the motion, about the ordinance rather. Largely, the extent to which it mirrors the same way the ordinance, the lodging tax is applied at the state level. Seems to me that the easiest way to apply this is to use the same base of rental receipts and then apply whatever percentage is in the Dewey tax to that same base of rental receipts. Also, the state law refers to not the owner of the property that is being rented, but in fact talked about the operator of the business. And I'm wondering if we shouldn't, again, stay as consistent with the way the state law is written and applied, so that we don't have any confusion. It may be that the owner of the property has really no role in the operation of the business. It's really the person, the operator of the business, the person who signs the business license application each year, I think should be made responsible. It seems to me that the more consistent we are with the state, the less confusing it will be for any of the hotel owners in applying the Dewey Beach tax versus the state tax. One other difference in terms of the state excludes anyone who is a resident within a hotel or a motel. And I'm wondering if we shouldn't consider that exclusion as well. So that, again, we're using the same base that's used by the state for imposing this tax. Those are all my comments.
Well, I would ask that you repeat your first comment. I didn't quite understand what the first comment was. I understood owner versus operator. I understood resident. What was the first comment?
Well, the first comment was just a general comment that we should try to use the same basis that the state uses for imposing its tax. So the comment about the owner operator is really intended to do that. The state law uses the term operator of the business rather than owner. The state law does exclude permanent residents from the base for the tax at the state level. And I'm just suggesting we should do that too, so that there's no confusion for the hotel owners who have to apply the Dewey Beach tax and the state tax.
All right. Any other comments from any other commissioners?
I have a question for Fred.
Mr. Bauer, go ahead.
So based on Gary's comments here, how does that apply? So someone is a private owner of a hotel would not have to pay tax?
So you're referring to the suggestion that we use the term operator. The problem from my perspective with that is that we don't have a definition of operator. So the use of the term person is just meant to be extremely broad. It's commonly employed, and it would apply, I believe, to an operator or a manager or an agent of the owner, as well as to the owner. So the use of the term person is just designed to catch everyone, and I believe it would catch an operator. I'm not sure what the legal significance would be if we were to limit the application of this to just the operator and not have a definition of operator. And two, whether we want, in the case of an enforcement action, not to be able to go against a property owner who points at an operator and says, it's not me, it's the operator who's not paying appropriately. I mean, do we want to limit our ability to enforce this just to an individual, currently undefined individual who I guess could skip town, and now our ordinance doesn't allow us to proceed against the property owner?
Right. So I don't understand the legalese part of that I need your assistance on.
Mr. Townsend, what if we were to say and or operator, owner and or operator? Would that cover it, or?
Well, right now we say person, and then we define person in a very broad way. So person is used in subsection C, and in multiple places the word person is used. I would recommend, if we change that we adopt a definition of operator that is specific to this ordinance, and then make reference to operators as opposed to persons. And, an operator could be an individual, such as an owner operator, but an operator could also be a legal entity. And I'm just a little concerned about changing that language in a way that might exclude from the definition someone or something that should be held accountable for non-payment.
I'll go to Mr. Persinger and then Mr. Jazinski.
Well, I mean, I think that is a decision for us to make. Do we want to be able to go after the owner if the owner is in fact not the operator? I mean, it is in the second sentence of the ordinance here, the draft ordinance. It says the payment of the tax shall be the responsibility of the person who is the owner. So the responsibility is placed solely on the owner at that point. And is that really what we want to do? Again, I was just trying to avoid any confusion with the state statute.
Mr. Jazinski.
Well, to kind of what Fred was saying, the first thing I thought when this came up is, the person who owns the property is the person that you can actually go after if there's a problem, like they don't pay their hotel tax, which happens sometimes with sales type taxes. People don't remit them. There are cases in many municipalities. So, the legislation lets them designate an agent, but as the owner, they're responsible for making sure whoever's running the property for them is collecting and remitting it. It's kind of like your water bill. You've got to make sure your water bill's paid if you're the owner of a building. I kind of view it as the same type of thing. And I think this gives them the flexibility to have anyone they designate collect it, but they need to know that ultimately they're responsible for making sure that it gets done.
Mr. Townsend, did you want to make any comment, or does anybody else have a comment on this?
I have nothing further.
No, okay.
I can comment on the occupancy comment that was made.
Go ahead, Mr. Townsend.
Mr. Persinger brought up a point that permanent residents of the unit are not required, or lodging tax is not imposed in that circumstance. And I could add an exception to the language in subsection B regarding the definition of occupancy and exclude permanent residents from that definition. So that would be a simple way to handle that comment by Mr. Persinger.
I have a comment, and then Mr. Stevens had his hand up. You know, and you don't have to answer me, Mr. Townsend, until Mr. Stevens gets his question in. But I thought about the people the condo units that might be rented out through the hotel here in Dewey. You know, would they be covered then? So, because they might be used as a permanent residence. But Mr. Stevens, go ahead.
Yeah, I apologize. When I read through this, I feel like anytime we start putting exceptions in, we're going to create more of an issue. And the way that it was read and the way that it was posted seemed to make sense on both of whether it's a resident or a permanent resident. That's how the state may want to do it for different areas or different types of leasing situations. I get that. And I think we need to put it on the owner for fiduciary responsibility and the ability to go back in case of a default and be able to attach it to the property. So I think the way it's been presented and the way that it's been written does not need any further changes.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Townsend.
And I would add that if state law prohibits the assessment of a lodging tax in a circumstance where it would apply to permanent residents, that we would not be authorized to collect it anyway. So remember, it's state law that has allowed us to impose the lodging tax to begin with. So we are still restricted by that. So whether we include an exception or not for that circumstance, we'll have to make a judgment as to whether or not we can collect it in that circumstance. I do suspect in a resort town like this, it's very seldom going to be an issue, but I
agree.
Just a thought. We talked about enforcement date or the date that it would be effective. I understand that some of you think that that April 1st, the beginning of our new year, is too soon. And I understand the logic behind that. I don't happen to agree with it, but I understand the logic behind it. I understand that a couple might want the far end of the spectrum to be January 2022. And I don't understand that at all. I think it's way too far. I think we ought to discuss this. And my personal opinion is July 1st, giving them a 3-month leeway into the fiscal year would be good. Mr. Stevens, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I just had a quick comment. We've received a lot of emails and concerning the date and the fact of when it should start. I processed that by looking at, when we looked at last year, and correct me and give me the right dates, Mr. Mayor, but we were closed as a town due to COVID for May and June completely, correct? Right. And so when I see a statistic that they're at 78% of the prior year, well, we couldn't even have people in town for those 3 months. When I look back at the prior year, the town was full. The beaches were full. The people were here, and every indication that I have talked to people are coming back in 2 weeks. They're coming back for the kickoff of the town. I would suggest, as a fiduciary representative of this town, is from a commissioners, that we put this in as soon as we're able to. They already have a mechanism for collecting it, so it's not like this is going to be an issue for them, and we need to put this in place.
So you would say April 1st, the beginning of the...
As soon as we can.
I'm going to go with commissioners first, and then I'll go back to Mr. Zumper, the town manager. Mr. Persinger.
I think putting it in April 1st is too soon. I don't think we have, but my concern is that if we put this in April 1st, my concern is what we're going to do with the money.
What are we going to do with what?
What we would do with the additional revenue that would be generated. I think that I know we had some discussion about this when we passed the original ordinance to go to the state and ask for authority to impose this tax. I believe that if we're going to, whenever we pass this, whenever we impose this tax, that we ought to talk about a specific use for it. And I think there should be some inclusion here that this should be provide at least should be contributed toward a capital improvement fund. We don't have one now. It's a critical need in the town. And I think that whenever we impose this, the fund should go there. I still believe that January 1, 2022 is the earliest date that we should include here. I don't think there's any logic to an argument that if we impose this tax, it's certainly going to help the hotels. I think there is an argument that we should give them every competitive advantage possible to help them get as healthy as they possibly can. And I think it is true that the town was basically shut down during the month of May. I don't recall it extending into June, but I could be wrong about that. But certainly there have been other impacts. I mean, we've not had large group presence, big event presence here in the town simply because the state rules have not allowed those kinds of gatherings. And I don't see them being allowed certainly in the very short term. Things are certainly going to ease up, but I don't think they're going to ease up that quickly so that we're fully open and operating as we have been in previous years. So again, I think it's a very fair compromise to certainly acknowledge that we need this tax, believe it's a fair tax, and that it's fair to delay the implementation of the tax to January 1, 2022.
I'd like to ask a question of almost anybody, but Commissioner Persinger, since you just brought it up, how do you feel that the imposition of this lodging tax with the fact that all the other area around here has probably double the lodging tax that we have proposed, and the fact that it's a pass-through, not a tax on the income of the hotel, but a pass-through tax. How do you feel, or how is it possible that it could hurt the hotels in Dewey?
You directing that at me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, I mean, I could argue either. I can't argue necessarily that will hurt them. I can certainly argue that it's not going to help them. And I think the extent to which you don't have a tax, and you may recall that Sussex County suspended its hotel tax for some time. I don't know if they have reimposed it at this point, but they did make the decision that there was a harm there and decided to suspend that tax. Again, I don't think there's any logical argument that says imposing this tax is going to help the hotels. It certainly can't do that. And again, it does provide them with a bit more competitive advantage to attract people back to Dewey Beach. I think there's a lot of pent-up demand. I think we are going to be pretty busy this year, but I don't mind at all providing some additional competitive boost to the hotels and getting those people back into their hotel rooms.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Jasinski and then Mr. Stevens.
Well, I didn't want to talk until we were kind of getting closer to done, but I guess I'll ask one thing. Commissioner Persinger, you asked about dedicating the revenue. Would you like to see it in the infrastructure fund since we already have one?
It could be in the infrastructure fund. I think it might be more appropriate to separate out a separate capital improvement fund. That's my view. It's really the critical needs we have, infrastructure and taking care of our capital improvement needs.
Mr. Stevens?
Yeah, I just want to comment on Commissioner Persinger's, the points that he brings up. I do not feel that we're going to be hurting the hotels you had put out, Mr. Mayor. This is a pass-through. We've got out-of-town people that are coming in, staying in our town, using our services, and then leaving. I do feel that we're going to have a very successful summer, and that we're going to have the hotels will be full. I do have a concern with those that have potentially already booked their rooms and didn't think about that in terms of, those that are coming in March or April. How does it affect them in terms of not having of passing this ordinance, whether it be as soon as humanly possible. I look at the reality of we live in a resort town and there is no resort fee. There are no tags. There are no funds that help the town run the day-to-day operations. If you have a $300 hotel room and you're putting a 1.5% tax, my little calculator says it's only $4.50, and you can't buy a beer in this town for $4.50. So I don't think that this is going to be a problem. And I'd recommend to the commissioners to allow, I understand the concept of restricted funds, but I would much rather see this go into the general fund, and out of the general fund, we have a long-term capital improvement project. And we understand that this is the equipment we need, this is the projects that we need, versus restricting it and then having a limitation on our town manager and let him do his job.
Any other comments from any other commissioners before I go to the town manager? Mr. Bauer?
Yeah, I understand it being a pass-through, but, I want to put a couple perspectives in here. A is hotel people, people have already booked. What are we going to do with them? So what you booked at, do they get charged that price, or they get charged whatever price we make it? So there's people who already have a reservation, I think should have an exemption. I think that's only fair. If I booked a room with the understanding I was going to pay 8% tax and I show up and you made it 9.5%. So I think we need to be fair to those people. That's issue number one. And, from the hotel perspective, their concern is that it makes the spread wider, right? Because the person that rents their house pays 3, they already pay 8, and now we're going to make it 9.5. So I understand that argument from them. And especially now, I'm optimistic we're going to have a great summer. No one's guaranteed it's going to be a great summer. Who knows what's going to happen here in the next, 90 days, 120 days. So if the hotels are still discounting to get their rooms filled, they're also eating into this tax as well. So I think, I'm in favor of enacting this, but the date is, what concerns me. I mean, April 1st is right around the corner. People are going to show up. What are we going to, what tax gets collected, and what's it take to implement this with the state? Is the state going to collect it, or are we going to collect it locally? So
that all, Mr. Bauer?
Yeah, I mean, that's my 2 cents worth on this thing. And I think we need to work through this issue before we come up with a date.
Thank you. Any other comments from commissioners? Mr. Stevens, you had your hand up?
No, I was pointing at
Okay.
our town manager.
I told him after the commissioners have theirs, then we could go to the town manager. Chain of command here. I personally, again, I'm going to say that I would have no problem if we instituted it April 1st. I think that's what everybody originally expected. I don't see, I'm going to repeat that, I do not see the logic how it could possibly hurt the hotel. It's a pass-through. They do not pay the fee themselves. They pass it through. And every other hotel around the area is much higher than what we are proposing. And so we would actually not be hurting them in any way. If we were going to hurt them, I would say absolutely not. I wouldn't vote for it if it was going to hurt them at any time, but I don't think it's going to hurt them. And the comment was made about 3% versus 9.5%. The town gets 3% of the income of every private home that is rented in the town, that's listed in the town for rental. We get nothing right now from the hotels, and we would only get an additional 1.5% if this were to pass versus 3% that the houses pay. And I know that the hotels pay the state. We can't do anything about that. It's not our fault that happens. It's not our desire that happens. Or maybe it is for some of you, but we don't have a say in that matter. So now, since all the rest have had their comments, I've had my comment, we'll go to Mr. Zolper, the town manager.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. Thanks, commissioners. So today's my 30th day in the seat, and I appreciate everybody's support and everybody's patience with me. But Rehoboth's got a 3% tax on the hotels. Bethany's got a 3.25. We've got 0. 1.5 is not going to hurt the businesses, I feel, here in Dewey Beach. Right now, as the mayor said, they pay nothing towards the town. but they do get the services of the police, the lifeguards, and everything else that goes into the town, the trash cans that are picked up on the street. So I think you're getting a good deal at 1.5 when you're coming into a town at $4.50 a night. I would also stress that working with the budget committee, working with Sheena and other folks, is that we do need the money. We do need to look at 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the road. I need to be able to say to the chief, we can afford that police car in 2 years without having to wait for a military vehicle that may be sold, as they've done in the past, to help pay for a police car. That just blows me away that may or may not even have happened, okay? But the fact that I don't have the money now to pay for a police car next year based on our budget, and I'm trying to make things work, it's really tough. So I think a 1.5%, whether it starts June 1st, July 1st, if we don't start it that early, we're going to be losing some revenue that we really need for the town. And again, at 5 years down the road, I would really like to have us looking at a new town hall or a new police station. This building is 30 years old, and this money coming in would really help. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Any other comments or whatnot from the commissioners? We're still not, Mr. Jazinski, your hand's up.
At this point, I'd just like to amend my motion to make the effective date July 1, and I'm hoping someone can second it.
I'll second that motion.
Well, I think the original person who seconded has to second the motion. Is that correct, Mr. Townsend?
Come
Mr.
on, Fred.
Persinger, will you agree to that change? Mr. Persinger?
Yeah, I disagree with it, but I will agree with it.
Okay, thank you very much. You have agreed, and there's a motion on the floor. Is there any further discussion? All right, the motion on the floor is 1.5% and July 1. Is that correct?
Yes.
Mr. Jazinski, is that correct?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Mr. Persinger is waving his hand frantically.
Okay. With little optimism of being successful here, I would like to propose that the ordinance be amended so that the proceeds from this tax go to be deposited in a capital improvement fund.
Yeah, I guess that would be me modifying my motion. This is a little bit out of order. I don't really have a strong preference either way. I'm always supporting unity when we can have unity. So does anyone really see it? I know Commissioner, I know one commissioner is against that, but does anyone else really have a big problem with it?
Well, I would prefer that if you're going to, I would prefer it not be designated, but if you're going to designate it, I would say capital fund and infrastructure fund. It's going to take hundreds of thousands of dollars and possibly millions to handle our drainage issue overall. So I would say capital fund and infrastructure fund. Commissioner Bauer, you had your hand up.
Yeah, and I think those are both one and the same. A capital improvement is an infrastructure project. So
no, that's not what an infrastructure. No. I disagree. I apologize. I have to let you know that there are two different items.
Okay. Anyhow, that was my opinion on it. I know the motion's on the floor for July 1. I'd actually like to see it be August 1, but I'm not sure where everybody else stands on that.
Well, it's been motioned and seconded. The motion says 1.5 of July 1. So Mr. Stevens, you want to comment?
Yes, I listened to our town manager talk about, whether you have lifeguard expense, you've got police expense, you've got trash pickup expense. That's all for what we're looking at in terms of what he needs to do to run this town. They're all part of the general fund. I'd ask the commissioners keep this money in the general fund and ask Budget and Finance to also put together a long-term capital improvement plan.
All right, Mr. Jazinski, I'll remind you that it's your motion. You can move to amend it or not.
Since there's so many different opinions, I'm not going to change the motion.
All right, the motion stands as is. Any further discussion? Hearing none, I'll call the question. And let's initially say all in favor, say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
All against, say nay.
I say nay, and my reasoning is I don't agree with the effective, I agree that we have to have the tax. I don't agree with the effective date. And my concern is that if we put this into the general fund, it's simply, the funds won't be available for capital improvement plan. You have to have money to fund the capital improvement plan. This would provide the seed money to do that. So that's the reasoning for my vote against.
Is there any other nays? Mr. Bauer?
Yeah, and
I'm sorry, we lost you.
You're
Mr.
muted,
Bauer?
Paul. You're muted, Paul.
We can't hear you. Mr. Bauer? Mr. Bauer? We
Paul,
can't
you're
hear you.
muted.
Somehow you're muted.
am I okay now?
No, you're muted. Go ahead and speak.
Oh, sorry about that. No, I mean, my reason for being a nay would be to implement this, not at July 1, which is the height of the season, but more so like August 1. So we're doing it, we're getting the money in, but we're just not doing it right at the height of the season. I hope, I'm hoping the businesses take off here in June and July, but hopefully we see it. July 1 is really is when it starts being the height of our season here. And
So
that looks like,
so that's a nay.
I'm a nay.
Are there any abstentions? Hearing none, I see 2 nays and 3 ayes. The motion carries. Okay. The next item on the agenda. I have to pull my agenda. No.
Town manager comments, Mr. Mayor.
I'm sorry.
We gotta do the
Town manager-
supplement.
We already did town manager's comments. Next item on the agenda is, I'm talking about for the last item that we had. The next item is discuss and possibly vote to approve the supplement to the town of Dewey Beach Street and Beach Maintenance Agreement with DelDOT. Mr. Dedes, if you would take on that question.
I would. As you all recall, we had a lot of discussion regarding the original proposal that was submitted. We got a telephone call, meaning myself and Mr. Zolper were and I believe the town manager was involved. The town attorney was involved later. It had to deal with a proposal that was submitted by DelDOT that they felt would help us in clarifying what our authority would be with wireless communication on the right of way. In particular, I think our issue had dealt with the beach lands. What they have proposed is to give us complete control of wireless services and wireless infrastructure permitting, with the exception of Route 1 and 1A, meaning Coastal Highway and King Charles, and that all wireless communication submissions for installation would come to the town of Dewey Beach for permitting. So that's what they've submitted. We discussed it ourselves, and we thought this would be a benefit and would probably follow better with our ordinance that was just recently passed. So that was their submission. Their attorneys drew up an agreement, and we said that we would present it to our town commissioners for their input and their decision as to whether to accept, not accept, or modify it. So that's where we stand.
Commissioner Jazinski, you had your hand up.
Just a quick question. So if we approve this, we'll now be in the permitting process for stuff along DelDOT right away.
No, we're not, with the exception of 1A and Coastal Highway. All other streets.
Okay, but basically this is giving us a little bit more control on all these side streets.
I agree, yes.
Okay, all right, good.
I have a question for Mr. Townsend. Mr. Townsend, have you had a chance to review this?
I have. I will say, though, that this is a pretty big departure from where we were. This was pretty surprising to me that they come back with this proposal, and I'm a little bit hesitant to say that I'm comfortable with it. I want to make sure there aren't any consequences that are unforeseen. There's quite a bit of language in here, of course, relating to wireless service providers that was not part of the old agreement. And they are maintaining in this agreement the desire to define their right-of-way as to include the 8 feet beyond the outermost edge of the paved streets.
Mr. Townsend, could you hold on one second? Mr. Bauer, Commissioner Bauer?
Yeah, I'm trying to get this off my iPad here.
You're on twice and you're repeating now.
I know. I'm trying. How do I get rid of this thing? Pull the battery out.
Now, Mr. Bauer, you sound like me now. Mr. Townsend, go right ahead.
So one of the items that the commissioners expressed some concern with from the last proposed addendum to this agreement was that we would be defining, by signing that, we would be agreeing that the right-of-way extends 8 feet beyond the end of these streets that stub at the ocean.
Correct.
That language was not apparent, or that definition of the right-of-way or definition of the beginning of beachlands was not evident in our prior agreement. This would have the effect of establishing that as a definition so that the right-of-way would extend 8 feet beyond the end of the road. So that's a substantive change.
Mr. Bauer, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I guess we need a motion to discuss this, correct?
Well, we're listening to Fred's explanation of my question to him right now. So do you have anything else you wanted to add, Mr. Townsend?
Just that I would ask that we consider tabling this for another meeting because I want to make sure that I'm comfortable with the advice I give you, and I can't say that right this minute.
I appreciate that.
So you would ask that we might table it now, is that right?
Yes, sir.
All right, Mr. Bauer, you had your hand up?
Yeah, no, if Fred thinks we should table it, I think it's a great idea.
Is that a motion?
Yes.
Motion to table by Mr. Bauer. Do we need a second for that, Mr. Townsend?
Yes.
Second.
Second by Mr. Stevens. Any discussion on the motion to table? Mr. Persinger?
Well, I don't know what's appropriate in terms of a discussion of a motion to table, but I had a question about the substance of the agreement. Is that something I can do at this point?
Well, if we're going to table it, then we can discuss it at the next time it comes up.
Well, yeah, I understand that, but I'd like to do that before. I'd like to make this comment before we table it. I just want to get this point out on the table.
Hold on one second. Mr. Townsend, what did you say?
Yeah, that's not impermissible.
Okay, Mr. Persinger, go ahead.
It's very simple. It just relates to the comment that Fred made about establishing 8 feet out from the end of the road surface, making that right of way. And if that's right of way, then it seems to me the beginning of this agreement, therefore, gives us authority to be the permitting process, the town be the permit issuer for anybody who wants to put a pole in that right of way that has been defined as 8 feet out from the edge of the roadway.
Correct.
That's the way I read it.
Mm-hmm.
And whereas we did not, without that change up front, we would not have had that authority in the original amendment that we looked at before.
Okay.
That's my understanding.
Thank you. And there's been a motion and table and a second. Any further discussion? All in favor, say aye.
I just have one question. I apologize, Mr. Mayor. Fred, was 4A added since the last time we looked at this?
Yes, 4A is new.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Jasinski, do you have your hand up?
No, I was ready to agree to the motion to table, so sorry.
Table. All right.
Motion called to question. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any against, say nay. Any abstentions? Unanimous. All right, the motion is tabled. We have, next item is town manager comments.
Nothing at this time, sir.
Commissioner comments, Commissioner Bauer,
No comments at this time.
Commissioner Jazinski,
No comments.
Commissioner Persinger,
No comments.
Commissioner Stevens,
No comment.
and Commissioner Mayor Cook. Just say thank everybody for paying attention and going through this long meeting. Thank you, Commissioner. I appreciate your help on this. A motion to adjourn will be accepted.
Motion.
So moved.